Good morning. Welcome to the August 30th Grants Pass City Council Workshop. We have Councilors Auger and Pell on the phone, as well as our accountant is on the phone. And because we have a citizen committee member here today, I'm going to switch minimum density to our first item. That might have been a surprise to whoever was presenting. Sorry. Oh, okay. Maybe we won't switch. Okay. So we'll go ahead and switch, but we'll just have a couple-minute wait here.
Rob
is now joining.
Vanessa Auger
Is now joining.
Hey, Vanessa and Rob, we are waiting just a minute to get started. We're going to do minimum density first before American Rescue Act. But I have sprung that on the staff, so they weren't quite ready to go, so we're just waiting a minute. Let's take care of agenda review while we're waiting. I guess first I'll just give you all a heads up. We are having an executive session later today and consulting with the outside attorney. He's going to be with us via phone, but he has a time constraint. So depending on whether this meeting starts to go real long, we also may move that executive session up before the legal services or fire chief discussion, just depending on time. We have a business meeting this Wednesday evening, September 1st. We have a public hearing to consider an ordinance that would be for the Summerfield North subdivision street plug vacation. Public hearing to consider an ordinance on the Carr property line vacation. An ordinance to amend Development Code Articles 12, 14, and 30 pertaining to social services facilities. That's the second reading. So it's actually marked as public hearing, but the public comment portion is closed. Then we have on consent calendar a motion to approve the transit hub findings of fact, as well as a resolution agreement with Motorola for portable radios for the Department of Public Safety, and 2 appointments for the CEDC. Next weekend is Labor Day, so our workshop is canceled. And then the following workshop would be on September 13th with a presentation from the Chamber of Commerce as well as the Small Business Development Center, SBDC, and the Southern Oregon Regional Economic Development, that's Inc., so ready. A discussion about the Landscape Xeriscape Development Code update, and then discussion regarding the Chamber of Commerce property. Any questions, Brian?
Yeah, thank you. I was just wondering if I could move on Wednesday's meeting, if I could move the resolution for the portable radios to a start item or off the consent calendar. I'm not sure what would be more appropriate, but start item would be fine with me.
Okay, you have questions about that one?
Yeah, I just have a couple questions.
All right.
And then I also have a question. I don't, and maybe I missed it, but I don't see on the agenda anything regarding COVID updates as far as the funding that we had discussed that's coming in, or things that the city may or may not want to consider doing as part of the emergency declaration.
Okay, well, at this time, there's no update on the COVID funding. We've got a little bit of confusion at the county, I guess. I'm not sure what's going on with that. Joel, did you have something?
Well, in addition to that update, I would like an update of the status of the mental health resources that are available and the physical addiction services that are available, and if they're meeting the need, and if they're not, how we can help our nonprofits get grants to meet those needs as a subject. And it's a pretty high priority because it has to deal with the COVID funding that we might use, and that we might use that. One of the things that strikes me is we can provide all the services we want for the homeless, but if we can't take care of the psych problems and the addiction problems, we're really not solving the problem. And nonprofits like Kelly's out there and some of the other nonprofits, I know when we were running a medical office, a lot of those people that we had as patients that were addicted or had problems had to go down to Medford. And it was a challenge for them, and the services weren't available here in Grants Pass. And that's a big problem, part of the homeless issue. And I would just like to get an update from, we also have a committee that on public health, joint committee from the county and city that address that. And so All Care, Grants Pass Clinic, Kelly's organization, you can. Somehow we need to get an assessment of whether the present facilities for mental health and addiction services are adequate, and if they're not, what we can do to work with our nonprofits to make it adequate.
Okay, so I think that yours is not specifically related to COVID, right? But are you talking about that in relationship to the ARPA funding?
Well, you know, it's related to everything. It's related to COVID because there's a lot of mental issues associated with COVID, and there's also some addiction, obviously, but it's not directly related. But it's related to everything.
Okay, and then Brian's request was for COVID vaccine promotion information, right?
Sure.
Okay. Any other items anybody wanted us to build in, DJ?
I have a question, Brian, about the Motorola. Whereas I'm in support of getting an item started and voted on individually, are these questions that you can get satisfied outside of the meeting with Aaron?
Probably.
Okay. Because, I mean, you know, we kind of have two things going on. If it's just inquiry and information gathering, or identifying something that might be not just rote progress, you know?
So I guess my question would be, if I approach Aaron and I get my questions answered and I feel that's information council should have, then should I bring it up at the Wednesday meeting at that point?
Sure. Yeah, I guess at this point, probably keep it starred. Let's see how that satisfaction goes with the meeting, with your inquiry, and just kind of play it by ear.
Okay.
Cool. Another thing I wanted to bring up was the construction excise tax. The Community Economic Development Committee has sort of talked about it. I understand they've had some public comment otherwise. I'd like to get that on their next agenda, and I think it's timely in that they will have a meeting before we have our next meeting about that. And so I wanted to see if council would support having that on the CDC's next meeting for an action item to be discussed. Construction excise tax, CDC.
Where do we have that slated right now?
It's
October 6th business meeting.
We need critical path scheduling.
Yeah, as I mentioned before, they're gonna have a meeting before that meeting, and I'd like to know what they think about it.
I think he's just wanting council support, whether you
I
also
didn't
want to know what they think about
feel it was
it.
appropriate for me to just, as an individual counselor, making that decision. I'm wanting council support for that. Okay, thank you. Another thing I wanted to bring up for agenda review was that this council has been taking steps towards the direction of purchasing a piece of property for urban campgrounds and operating them. These decisions have been made in large part in closed doors. I'm becoming uncomfortable with having these discussions and considerations without our constituents knowing about it. So I would ask that we have a public meeting, workshop, to talk about those things and start garnering sentiment from our constituents.
All right. Anything else? Vanessa and Rob out there, anything for agenda review before we move on?
So Sarah,
Yes.
on the mental health.
Fine.
On the mental health and physical addiction, are we going to schedule that, or what are we going to do with it?
Well, yes, I mean, partly if you're talking about American Rescue Plan Act funds, then you just may want to bring that up during the course of that discussion, even later today.
The only thing is, we need to know the existing situation, on whether there's a shortage or not. I'm sure there is, but, and what the resources are. We need to have our community and nonprofits talk to us.
So you want to just have a workshop in general about that? Okay, is there council support for that? I'm
Has-
seeing
has-
Valerie and DJ. Brian?
Has that been in a workshop before in the last year or two? No?
I can't remember if we had a formal meeting.
Not necessarily to the extent, I think, of what Councilor King is looking for. I think I have an understanding of continuing services with regards to the mental health and addiction, having an idea of that continuum and what that looks like.
Okay, in that case, let's move on to minimum density. Sorry to spring that on you, Jason, but thanks for coming down a little early.
Well, hello, Council. I am Jason Mackey, Associate Planner in the Community Development Department. I know that you have a busy agenda today, so I will try to be to the point as much as possible. So we're going to be discussing minimum density again today. And just to give you a little bit of a background, in March of this year, the Housing Advisory Committee motioned to recommend that council consider a potential development code text amendment that would establish minimum residential density standards in the R3 and R4 zones, including a requirement to build to at least 60% of the maximum density on a per site basis. Based on that motion, staff and the chair of the Housing Advisory Committee presented the motion with a presentation to council during a workshop session. And in conclusion of that presentation, council continued the discussion with direction for staff to follow up with more information. So here's a list of the items that council directed staff to follow up with. The first being to expand the analysis to include the R2, R32, and R42 zoning districts. Again, to expand the analysis to include minimum density standards at 70, 75, and 80%. Also to provide some examples of minimum densities in other municipalities, and provide examples of variance or exemption requests when minimum densities can't be met. Some language around what a tiered response would look like, and to provide examples of other existing developments within the city, Grants Pass, which have densities greater than 60%. So the next few slides are going to be information that was presented last time, but I just wanted to give you a recap of what exists in the development code today. So there's 4 areas of the code that currently affect density. The first is Schedule 12-2, which regulates land use. Schedule 12-5 is minimum lot requirements by zone. And 2 schedules, 12-4, one is maximum density and the other is minimum density. A lot of information on this picture, but basically we have allowed land use types based on zone. So just real quickly, you can see in the R16 zone, a detached single family home is can be approved through a building permit, whereas in the R32 zone, a single family home would need to be approved under a PUD process. And our base lot standards affect density, for example, lot size, and then also the minimum lot size per dwelling unit is affected by this chart. Again, this is a chart that you saw during the last presentation, but it does now show the expanded zones. But really, this is kind of compiling some data from the other 2 slides that you just saw in a little bit more of an easier to read format. So the bottom 2 rows, you'll see max density and minimum density. I will talk briefly about those after a few slides, but I just wanted to give you a couple of quick examples of how planners apply these sections of code. So this first example here is it's a half-acre lot. It's zoned R3. If an applicant was to come in and propose a 4-lot subdivision to be developed with single-family homes, under today's standard, this would be approved. Meets minimum lot size, meets the land use type, does not exceed maximum density, and meets minimum density. Similar example, this one's in the R41 zone. It's a 10,000 square foot lot. There's an existing triplex on the lot. If an applicant was to come in and propose a 4th unit, it would be approved because it meets the standards that we discussed previously. Another quick example using the 2 designation, so the R32, different standard than the R31. It's a half-acre lot, zoned R32. An applicant comes in, proposes a 4-lot subdivision with single-family homes. It would not be approved because the R32 zone requires a minimum of a duplex on each lot. So looking more closely at what's currently in our code for maximum density, you can see here on the right-hand side, this is our current max density that we're going to use to potentially calculate a minimum density. So I just want to call out again that currently in our code, we do have standards around minimum density. And those are applied to zones with an M designation. And so this chart 12-4B is how it appears in our code today. We set in the R3 and R32 zones a minimum density of 12.4 dwelling units per acre. And in R41, R42, and R5, the code sets the minimum density at 20 dwelling units per acre. We don't actually use this standard because currently there are no zones within the UGB that have an M designation, but it does exist in the code as an option. So this is that same chart we saw previously. It just, using the M designation, assigns these minimum densities to the corresponding zone. So just another example using the same lot, a half-acre lot zoned R31M. Applicant proposes a 4-lot subdivision to be developed with single-family homes. It would not be approved because the proposal would need to meet a minimum density of 6.22 units in any combination as the code is written today. So now going into some of the new information that you requested, just a little bit of a recap. The Housing Advisory Committee adopted a 2021 priority to move our community towards establishing minimum density requirements to increase the supply of housing. And this was primarily based on the goal to preserve moderate to high density residential zones for densities greater than single family homes. And there's a few bullet points that are identified in the draft 2021 housing needs analysis. The third one really was a driver of this goal, to have a mix of housing types other than single-family detached housing. So a few of these slides are going to have a lot of information, but I'll do my best to kind of call out the highlights. Really, this is just getting a sense of scale of how many acres and how many lots are in these zones that we're talking about. And the less than $10,000 is really our attempt to identify the number of vacant lots within those zones. And the less than 50,000 really assumes an under-improved lot, likely something's going to be demolished in order to put a new development on the site. And this is just a graphic illustration of the data in the previous slide. Again, to get a sense of scale of the lots that could be affected by a minimum density. And the red outline is lots within those zones that have an improved value less than $10,000. So we're making the assumption that those are the vacant lots. Just a zoomed in screenshot of the previous map where you can see some of those, what we're assuming are vacant lots. So at our previous discussion, we really focused on the 60% numbers, but this expands it out to the 70, 75%, and 80% minimum densities based on this maximum density number. So you can get a sense of how the requirement changes across those different percentages. My observation is really that, it's most significant in the R41 and R42 zones. As you can see, it would be 21 units, minimum density at 60%, but then would jump up to 28 at 80%. So this picture here just takes the previous schedule 12-4B that I showed previously, and plugs in these minimum density numbers at 60%. So another slide with quite a bit of information, but the idea behind this slide is to just look at what the opportunity would be if we were to implement a 60% minimum density. So I just want to call out these numbers are based on gross density. Net density is going to be quite a bit different because this gross density doesn't take into account wetlands, steep slope areas, things of that nature. But under today's standard, the minimum allowable density based on the acreage in these zones, the vacant lots would be 532 units, whereas if we had the requirement of a 60% minimum density of the max density, it would be about 2,800 units. So quite a bit of difference there. And this is the same example, just using 80% to, again, give you guys a sense of what the difference between 60 and 80% is. Same chart, under today's standard, it would be 532 units would be the minimum allowable density, but with an 80% minimum density development code amendment, it would be closer to 3,900 units. So again, quite a bit of difference. So the next few slides are going to be examples of existing development around town. I thought this would be helpful information as you look through some of those. These two columns really just call out the number of lots within the zone above 1 acre, which is a relatively small number, and the percentage of lots less than 10,000 square feet, which is about 3/4 of the lots on average throughout these zones. So the first development we have here is off of Redwood Avenue. It's currently under construction. Definitely a good example of density. Little bit less than an acre in the R3-1 zone. It's approved for 1 single family home and 6 duplexes. The max density would be 13.92. So the percentage of minimum density would be 93%. This is a little bit of an older development. It was actually approved in maybe about the late 70s, so the standards were not quite the same. It is an example of a land division that was included in the approval. So it was a parent parcel that was partitioned into 3 lots. Each lot was developed with a 4-plex. So it's over a half-acre lot in the R3-1 zone with 12 units. It actually exceeds maximum density. Just kind of an example of how the number that we set for maximum density has an effect on what ultimately would become the minimum density. A more recent development on the corner of L Street, 0.11 acres. It's in the R4-1 zone. I think this is a good example to really call out the difference in how minimum density would be set based on the max density, which is much more significant in the R4 zones. So we have 3 units. The max density would be just a little under 4. So a pretty much fully developed lot at 78% of max density. Another recent development under construction, It's in the R4 zone. It's proposed to be developed with 8 lots. The maximum density is a little bit under 12. Would be 67% of max density for this development. So this example here is a little bit different housing type. It's attached single-family homes, condominium development. A little bit larger lot than the examples that we've seen before, about 5.5 acres. It's in the R31 zone. 88 units were proposed, and it's about 90% of max density. I think this might be the last example here, but this is really more of your apartment complex type of development. In the R41 zone, 43 units were proposed, and it's 91% of max density. Oh, one more here. I would imagine that most of you are familiar with this project. I would say it's, probably one of our most significant multifamily developments. Right next door to the condo development that I showed previously. The lot size is about 3 acres. It's in the R31 zone. There's 50 units, and it's 96% of the max density. So we have 2 examples of minimum density standards from around Oregon. The first one is in Ashland. There's a lot of text here. The takeaway is that they use 80% of max density as their minimum density standard. And so they do have an exemption for minimum density. The main one being is that minimum density does not apply to lots less than 10,000 square feet. And there are some allowances for environmental constraints, streams, wetlands, steep slope. And the next example is Tigard. Again, they use 80% of the maximum density allowed in each zone. And similar exemption. What's a little bit different about this one, they do allow exemptions for lots less than 3/4 of an acre. And there is some language that allows the director to have some discretion in an approval based on an application. So it's definitely a complex topic. There's a lot to consider. I'm sure you're all aware of that. These are just a few bullet points that kind of stood out. We have some current language in the code that applies minimum density to a site, but other examples or other possibilities are applying the minimum density to a lot. So, for example, if there was a subdivision, the minimum density could apply to the approval of the subdivision, or it would be a requirement of each lot within the subdivision. One interesting takeaway from looking at several examples of minimum density around the state is whether or not we round up or down. That definitely has a pretty significant impact on the requirement. So, for example, if the minimum density was calculated at 3.8, would the applicant be required 3 units or 4 units? There are a lot of site constraints that affect development of a lot, some that we've talked about, but setbacks, wetlands, steep slope, parking, building height, open space. It was brought up in the last meeting, but there's definitely building code implications. There's certainly, generally speaking, an increased cost to development when developing a multifamily complex relative to single-family home development. And there's various market forces affecting multifamily development. There's definitely a developer perspective to this topic. And I hope I didn't go through all of that too quickly. I am happy to answer any questions. But there's a few options for direction from council. You could request additional research for a future workshop presentation, direct staff to proceed with a development code text amendment, refer the topic back to the Housing Advisory Committee and or the Urban Area Planning Commission based on this new information that staff's provided, or potentially not pursue a minimum density code amendment at this time. So with that being said, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Jason. Any questions? Rick?
Thank you, Jason. Do I recall correctly, the Housing Advisory Committee recommended a 60%?
That is correct.
All right, thank you.
We do have Kelly Wessels here from the Housing Advisory Committee, but any questions for Jason before we, Valerie?
It may be in here, but that was a lot of information for my little pea brain to soak in. So I just want to ask, how many in the housing needs analysis, how many housing units did they say that we were going to need? I mean, when I look at the difference between the 60 and the 80, I guess that's what I'm taking a look at, is how many units did they say we would need, and where does that fall amidst that all?
Sure, I'm gonna look over to Brad. Is it 2,000?
Yeah, it was 4,055 was the number that they came in. That's for 2040. So the housing needs analysis looked at the 20-year, which we're a little under 20 years now because it looked at 2040. But the number they had is 4,055 new dwelling units by that point.
Joel?
So then, of that 4,055, the different percentages, what do they provide in terms of potential for new housing? So at 60%, how many units? At 70%, how many units? 80%, how many units?
Yeah, you want to go back to that earlier slide that you had that showed the housing and needs analysis, Jason. But while he's doing that, I can tell you the housing needs analysis itself is, it's not so much prescriptive in that you take a zone and you say in this zone you're gonna get this. It's more on housing type, saying okay, in the single family dwelling world, this is really what we're aiming for, which there's not honestly a huge change in that. We have been predominantly single family. The housing needs analysis assumes we're going to continue to develop at that rate. It just, there are some tweaks, and then it looks at townhouses and sort of those attached single, and then it looks at kind of the middle housing and then the multifamily. So I think the numbers are up there now. That third bullet talks about 18% being townhouses, 13% being apartments, 6% manufactured housing, and 3% in group quarters, dorms and things like that, which we are actually doing pretty well. If you look at our townhouse percentage right now, it's not too far under that target of 18%. But in order to achieve those, we would need to increase a bit above where we're at today.
So if I was to look at that last bullet statement where it said the current UG is sufficient to meet that 4,000 units, would that assume that any minimum density for the UB to satisfy those 4,000 units, or is that what are the assumptions that go into that? Am I communicating?
Yes. It gets a little bit nuanced because the 2 designation currently does indirectly require a minimum density. In the R32 zone, it requires a minimum of a duplex per lot. And in the R4 too, it requires the minimum of a triplex. So I would say it's safe to say it definitely assumes that, but likely not a minimum density as what we're discussing.
So if I understand your answer, then to the urban growth boundary at less than 60% minimum density is sufficient. I'm not sure I'm not sure that that's the way we need to go, but if I understand your answer correct, that's what I heard you say.
I'll defer to Brad to give a firm answer.
Yeah, no, that is correct.
Seems correct.
Okay, thank you.
Brian, then Valerie.
Yeah, I have a question, but just to follow up on Joel's question, on slide 23 and slide 25, it talks about how many more units we would be getting at a 60% density and at an 80% density, so that might help to answer your question as well. And then I just had a question about the M zoning. Sounds like, we have it, but it's not really utilized, and so I'm wondering if we know how long we've had it and why it's not utilized at this point.
The short answer is I don't know. We just don't have any zone. It would be a different zone, even though they're really similar, R31 and R31M. It would just be a different zoning designation, and I'm just not familiar with why it is that we don't have any M designated zones.
Okay, thank you.
My understanding is that provision has been in the development code since at least 2014, possibly earlier.
Valerie.
Yeah, my question goes to the zoning of the UGB, because obviously the UGB hasn't been completely rezoned, or is this utilizing the consultant who did rezone the UGB? It just hasn't been accepted by ODOT as of correct. That's what I'm wondering. Has the zoning been done? It just hasn't, we haven't gotten to that point to be able to do it because of the ODOT trip hazard or whatever it is, having to do the TIAs. Am I correct that we are using the updated zoning of the UGB to get these numbers?
The housing needs analysis numbers?
Yes.
Yes, that is correct. The housing needs analysis did use the projected densities that are in the urban growth boundary rezone project, which haven't been executed yet because of ODOT. But yes, that 4,055 number of units that's projected to be needed in 2040 did assume that those zones in the urban growth boundary would be in place.
Okay, great. So that answers my question. So then basically they are saying that we will, using the UGB currently, we shouldn't have to expand the UG, that if we build according to the zoning that's been provided, we should be able to get the units that we need.
Right. And I think maybe it's worth pointing out that the state of Oregon, doesn't allow for these housing needs analysis to look in any way at whether the properties are actually available. So it's like development, like patterns we've seen always. If a property comes up for sale, property owner or developer buys it and they develop to that density, but the housing needs analysis just purely looks at the availability, not the availability, but the land itself, the zoning, what it could be, but the timing, of course, is 100% unknown.
And I'm assuming, does it take into effect geographical things like wetlands and slope and all that sort of thing on the property?
Yes, the housing needs analysis is required to look at developable and non-developable lands, and it uses some of the same statistics as the basis that Jason pointed out in terms of the vacant being a value of 10,000 or less and things like that. So it does take those limitations into consideration.
Thank you.
Other questions at the moment? All right, Kelly, you were here on behalf of the committee. Did you want to talk?
Good afternoon. I think that the primary thing is to just emphasize, and I think that they touched on it in the presentation, is that the HAC has spent some considerable time on this subject. And one of the things that we feel is that there's been questioning about the 60%. We said at least 60%, okay? And that we would be open to the other. But the fact of the matter is that that seemed like the number that would be most acceptable to all parties as a starting point. We felt that we needed to take into consideration some other opportunities. And when you think about the fact that with that number and the slide that he presented, it brings us out of that 4,055, that brings us to 3,331 units, right on at 60%. So if there's some of the projects that go above that, we get a lot closer to that number. And it's all about affordability as well, because as we increase units, we start taking down that price of affordability, which is one of the biggest issues for people in housing. So there were a lot of factors. I just want to touch on that lightly. Anything else, Brad, that you think is of relevance? Because I think it's pretty cut and dry. That's where we're at this point. Any questions? Cool.
Any questions? Valerie, did you still have a question for Jason?
I guess I was just trying to explain, and DJ kind of helped me, the difference between the two maps that you had up there. I just want to make sure that I understood them. Yeah, that one and then the one right afterwards.
The only difference is the red outlined lots, which are the lots that have an improved value less than 10,000. So the assumption is the red outlined lots are the vacant lots.
Okay.
To give you a sense of how many lots are actually vacant within those zones, which are most likely to be developed under this new minimum density if it were to be
Okay.
implemented.
All right, thank you.
Joel?
The last question I had, and then maybe Kelly or you could answer it, I'm not sure. I have a friend who was going to do high density up in Forest Grove. It didn't pencil out. Is there a difference from the perspective of the private contractor? I mean, we can make the code that says this is high density, this is low density, but if it doesn't pencil out, it's not going to happen, you know, for those 4,400 units. Whereas if there was lower density, it might pencil out. I don't know, but economic viability is a perspective that I don't have right now from the private contractor. If it all pencils out, regardless of what the minimum density is there a difference?
It's definitely an excellent point. Anecdotally, we very commonly hear developers, planning staff hears from developers that projects don't pencil out when it comes to multifamily development.
So we can zone it all we want, but it won't happen.
Right.
So if I can get in here on that one a little bit. So, you know, affordability and multifamily, the cost analysis can be pretty complex. And I do know that majority of multiplexes that go into communities that have success in doing those, they rely heavily on grant subsidies and tax incentives and otherwise that are there purposed, knowing that these are very difficult to pencil and they're there because they're needed. And those resources only go so far. So just take that into consideration.
And if I can add to that too, being the wife of a developer who has indeed developed those, the things that most people don't think about is when you build a multifamily, there are a lot of costs that pop up. And they're not one-time costs. You're talking standing water costs for sprinkler systems, you're talking about elevators, you're talking about fire standards, you're talking about ongoing, because now I think it's every 18 months you have to have an inspection, which costs like $5,000 of your elevator. So there's a lot of costs that go in once you get to multifamily that are not there with, say, a duplex, triplex, or even a fourplex. So those are the types of costs that most people do not understand, and they are, once again, ongoing costs. So it's not a one-shot deal. It's something you have to pay all the time. And so those are the sorts of things that do make it much more difficult to do a multifamily as opposed to duplexes, triplexes, because some of those costs aren't there.
Rick?
Jason, do you know if it would be possible when you have exemption criteria, because like wetlands or other physical factors, could you actually include some form of maybe not compensation, but latitude to approve a development that may not meet, say, if it was 60%, may not meet the 60% because it's not penciling, maybe 50% pencils, but 60% doesn't. Could we put something in there that would give that latitude?
Definitely. If we look to the example for the exemption request from Tigard, it's explicit in saying that an applicant can propose a density that could then be approved by the director. So there would be some discretion to say, okay, well, there's some wetlands and you can't meet the 80%, but X amount of area is developable, so 70% is more appropriate for this specific site. It's definitely a direction that council could go with in terms of creating an exemption.
DJ?
Yeah, I do have some more questions about exemptions, either Jason or Brad. So I think entertaining exemptions because of obvious steep slope or those kind of different things. If we use the example you had about the half-acre unit,
Up here.
just picture of it's fine. So, and I'm just presuming here. So we have a half-acre lot, and you need 6 units on it. 6.22, and then we get in the rounding issue, and everybody to pay attention. Does this community decide that 7 units or 6? That's also really important. So exemption, so I see this lot, it's landlocked other than access from the north. We need to entertain exemptions on what if that's not possible to do? What if it's, with a street and all those things without going, higher vertical or otherwise to get those units in here? We need to discuss threshold or criteria that a developer could exercise through code to demonstrate that this isn't a possible expectation. So I kind of want to dig into that. Have you made those kind of considerations?
So we have the 2 examples from Ashland and Tigard that, have detailed code language about what those exemptions would be. When it starts getting into, cost, I think it gets very uncomfortable for staff to be having to make that kind of decision. So, I mean, I wouldn't recommend that we go there if that's the sole basis. But I think anything else, I mean, if what you're saying is, if setbacks, parking requirements, landscape buffers, I mean, at the end of the day, if the developer sits down, pencils this lot out, and he can't meet the minimum standards for all of those different topics, I mean, I think that's the kind of thing that can easily be built into the exemption in a code. Sure. So I think we could, do that.
Yeah, I think that's a worthwhile effort. I know of properties in town that they don't pencil, and they sit and they have sat, and we've looked at them, and they're so far off. You don't even go to step 2 in consideration. If you were to tack on a minimum density requirement for those lots, then it would just further exaggerate that problem. So I know that problem exists, and we would be wise to consider those things.
Joel?
Well, based on my limited knowledge, and I count on the rest of the council and the wisdom, because I don't know everything, but at this point in time, I would favor the 60% with liberal exemptions. I certainly, I don't think I would go any higher than that just because of the economic considerations, and we do want contractors to be willing to take on the projects and not just leave vacant lots.
Brian, then Rick?
Have we moved to discussion?
I think, does anybody have any questions? Is it a question or a discussion? Okay, Rick, question.
So is there a way, instead of, I want to say penalizing people because this is what needs to be done, is there a way of offering bonuses in the process for achieving that rather than so we could get the same result? Would that be a possibility?
It's definitely a possibility. It would be another thread to this whole discussion, but definitely examples of that throughout the state.
Rob and Vanessa, do you have any questions before we move on?
Thank you, Mayor. I have none at this time.
Thank you.
Thank
Rob?
you. I'm fine for now.
Okay, thank you. Is it a, well, Brian was first, if you, okay. Yours is a discussion? Yeah. Okay, Brian, then DJ.
Thank you. So I don't think I need to remind anyone here that we are in a housing crisis and we are at the front end of solving that housing crisis. We have this list of items from Housing Advisory Committee of 30 recommendations, and we're just now considering the top 2 or 3 of them. So we are nowhere close to being out of the woods on solving the housing crisis here. So I just want to make sure everyone remembers that, first of all. Second of all, this was an awesome presentation. There was so much information in here. And I'm seeing examples, all the examples that staff brought of successful projects at high density. There's one at 93%, there's one at 120%, there's one at 78%, there's one at 90%, there's one at 91%, another one at 96%. So to say that these densities are not achievable is false. And I think setting the density too low, I think we would not solve the housing crisis to the level that we potentially can if we consider something closer to an 80% density. And I appreciate that staff brought other municipalities as examples that are already using an 80% density with extensive exclusions and variance processes so that if 80% is not able to be met, there are mechanisms with which to bypass that. So personally, I'm still leaning towards the 80%. It looks like in our community, from the examples that staff gave, it's achievable. And from other municipalities, it looks like there are ways to get around it if lots are not able to achieve that for whatever reason.
DJ?
Sure. So we need to be really careful to not overshoot the goal here. When you see a problem and you see a potential solution, it's very easy to connect A and B without seeing the implications of those decisions. As I mentioned before, I'm aware of lots, many lots, that cannot be utilized, especially considering minimum density requirements. We have to take into consideration those site constraints that we looked at versus percentage minimum densities. Those 70, 80, 90% density utilizations are maximum ideal circumstance to build those units. Maximum. Rick, I know you understand what I'm saying. Those are fantastic examples, and it's great that that works for some. Without knowing exactly, I would say that would be the minority of available buildable lands for those kind of densities. I'm concerned about moving too far forward into the goal. Being a builder, I have boots on the ground, frontline experience with these kind of things, and 80% would be way overshooting the goal. 60% seems to be somewhat reasonable based on my experience and the experience of others that I work with. That being said, we really need to be careful and look into exemptions. I've called them variances before, but that's not the right word. Are we calling them exemptions? We really need to dig into that exemption land, because even with a 60% density utilization, I can think of 4 properties off the top of my head right now that would not work, you know, and so they would require an exemption of some kind, right? Because we need to use those lands, and I would hate to implement a policy that would further prohibit use of those lands.
Valerie?
I'm going to agree with DJ, because at one point in time, because this has been on my plate for a long time, is I did call a number of contractors within our community. And one of the things I heard over and over again was the lots that are available are unbuildable. They're expensive, and it's hard to fit what you want on that lot. Now, do we need to do something? Yes, 60% I feel comfortable with. In looking at those 97, those 96, let me give you a little heads up. 3 of those, and one that we just recently was approved, are all tax credit, and meaning that the money came from tax credits, and that is a highly competitive issue in this state. And that is exactly why ABS did not get funded for theirs, and Jackson County did, because Jackson County is a local nonprofit entity building, and so they did get funding for that. But I am telling you that it's extremely competitive going down the road. So that's not going to be, and until the feds put more money into it, it's not going to happen here. So I think 60% with just knowing the fact that part of what's holding us up right now is ODOT in not developing our UGB. And once we get that UGB up and going, that will make more land available for developers. That's what's right now has put the brakes on us, I think, as much as anything else. So I think moving forward, cautiously at 60%, would go a long ways in helping our density. I think if you go too fast and too furious, that you turn off the developer, and it won't happen.
Rick, then DJ, then Brian?
I agree with the comments that Valerie has made, and I've heard from people, they're very concerned about the minimum density. And I would be supportive of the 60%, but anything over that I think would be put a burden on our community of trying to provide housing. But I would also like to see some aspect, if there's some way that we could encourage building to a more minimum density by providing incentives as well. Thank you.
DJ?
So it's a fine opportunity to say, in my opinion and the opinion of every developer that I've talked to, that the #1 contributing factor to our housing urgency is available buildable lands inventory. We need to solve that first before we actually start seeing an appreciable change. That being said, October 4th, we've slated a conversation workshop about buildable lands inventory and then the urban growth boundary. The purpose of that is to go back to 2012 minimum and learn all of the things that have been done and talked about, recommended consults, etc., to educate council on where we currently are in available buildable lands inventory, so we can understand that issue and start pursuing a solution to that problem. And as I said before, I believe that is the #1 by far contributing factor to our our housing crisis. So look forward to that conversation.
Brian?
Thank you. So I have a few things. The first one is that there's a bullet on slide 16 that says the results of the housing needs analysis indicates that the current UGB is sufficient to accommodate future housing needs. So that's in the housing needs analysis. And then if we look at slide 23 that has the breakdown of what would happen at a 60% density, which is on slide 23. Slide 23. So it shows there, if everything was built out to 60% density, we would have 3,331 units. The housing needs analysis says we need 4,055. So, and also the housing needs analysis, as Brad said, I believe, that assumes that all the land is available, which it is clearly not. Like, all of the land is not available. That's just the vacant land. And then it also says that the calculations assume gross density, not net density. Net density results in fewer units than what that number is. So I just want to make sure council understands that the housing needs analysis says we need 4,055 at 60%. Best case scenario, we have 3,331. And we're not going to get to best case scenario. It's just not realistic. So it's even lower than that. And I know that this council historically has been very developer friendly. I know we have a developer on council and some other people in the industry. And I feel the need to point that out because we need to take this problem seriously.
Joel?
So the numbers with the 4,000 units within the existing lots, if they were all developed, would meet the need. We know they're not going to be all developed, so we're going to have to expand the urban growth boundary. I think that's a given. And the numbers are there if you developed everything, which we're not going to do. The other thing is, we've seen examples where there was no minimum density and people put in the maximum amount that you've cited. And so I would assume that where it's feasible to do so, contractors would continue to do that, especially if there were incentives. To require that, I think, within the existing urban growth boundary, because of those numbers, I think would unnecessarily handicap the private sector. I don't want to favor them, but I don't want to handicap them because they do serve a need in providing housing for our community. And that's where I would stick with the 60%. Realizing that the amount will actually be higher as it is today. Because there's a lot of developers that are developing to even higher densities. And it would probably work both ways, but I think we want a healthy contractor community. And I know you do too.
Brian?
Absolutely. We want a healthy contractor community. I don't want to unduly burden developers. But I think specifically in the R3 and R4 zones, it's really important to build those out to a high density just so we can maximize the use of that high density land. I think the R2 zoning probably, you know, a 70 or 60% would probably be more appropriate for the R2, giving more flexibility. But I think the R3 and the R4 zone, there is not a lot of that land available anymore. And I think the little bit that we have left, we would be very wise to consider a 75 to 80% density on that with an extensive, we're not using the word variance, but exclusion process, so that, you know, even if it's not available at that percentage, that it can still be built on at a lower percentage. So my concern is more around the R3 and the R4 zoning and just getting as many units as we can and not squandering that opportunity.
Mayor?
Yeah, go ahead, Vanessa.
Thank you. I would like to provide a little bit of framework and provide a voice to a majority of the community. As we know, 62%, if we round up 63% of Grants Pass renters are rent burdened. 1 out of 3 renters are paying more than 50% of their income in rent. 3 out of 4 renters with extremely low incomes are paying more than 50% of their income in rent. And typically, these are younger families. My ward, Ward 4, the ward that I do represent, is easily one of the most rent-burdened communities in all of Grants Pass, with actually a large swath of Ward 4 being 97% of them being extremely rent-burdened. So I think it's important to provide that framework and that voice to this discussion as well. Typically, we're only hearing one side of the issue, and that is of the development community. Not to say that one is more important than the other, but there really are 2 sides to this discussion. And so when we talk about a housing crisis, I think it's very important that we hone in on the word crisis, because if our house is on fire, we're not going to be casually gathering our children and casually gathering our animals to get out of the house. We are going to be getting out of that house as quickly as possible. And that is what we need to be doing in a housing crisis. We need to be turning every stone and aggressively chasing every channel to get our head above water in the situation of a crisis. So with that framework being laid, I would be in support of an 80% minimum density with a tiered approach. I'm not interested in having a lot of carve-outs. I do understand that minimum setbacks and landscape requirements, green spaces, I understand all of that. So I would be in favor of a tiered response. So if the developer says 80% absolutely cannot be met with a burden of proof on the developer, at that point it would, the planning staff can help them look at 75% and then 70% and then 65% and so forth until that density can be met. And going back to the buildable lands inventory analysis that was done, for any questions, it is on page 23 of that report, where it does outline that the findings indicate the amount of existing vacant and partially vacant land within the UGB, is sufficient to accommodate our 20-year housing needs. That is with the consideration that the land is developed on as it is intended to be developed on, and I think that this is a step in the right direction for that.
Thank you. Further discussion? Valerie?
Well, I would just like to, go with what Rick said. I think it is very important that we incentivize the density. That's where we put a good part of our incentive is to help with incentivizing, which is why we have been working and trying to get some money into that to try to incentivize the R3 and R4 density. So I agree with that, but I still stand my ground that we've been in this crisis and we've been out screaming for builders and developers, and we have started to see some growth, and I agree with that, but we're still in the same place we were with multifamily housing, and it's not because people, it just doesn't pencil out. Nobody is going to go out and develop land and build something if they can't, by giving away things. It just doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. So yes, we need to incentivize it, but we also need to do what we can to get the duplexes, triplexes in our housing inventory.
Brian?
I appreciate Valerie's points. I think there's a difference between it not penciling and there being a more profitable opportunity for developers to do. And I think there's probably both of that happening. I think there's probably situations where it doesn't pencil, and I think there's probably situations where developers are like, oh, I can build single family houses and make more money. Why would I do this other thing? I think both of those things exist. And so I think the minimum density at the R3 and the R4 zones helps us to not squander that valuable high-density inventory for single-family homes. Again, I would feel a little more flexibility in the R2 zoning as it is a medium-density zone.
All right, well, I'm not hearing any requests for more information, so as far as where we go forward on this topic.
I have requested more information.
Okay, DJ?
I have requested more information about explicit exclusions. What can we entertain as far as exclusions go? I need to look at that. I'm actually hearing every one of these counselors talk about either loose exclusions or thorough exclusions or otherwise. I need to know what that looks like.
Do you want to see that before something is drafted up?
Yes, absolutely.
All right, well, in that case, we have a request to see more exclusions. Brian?
Well, I'm seeing in our slideshow, we have a full page of exemptions from Ashland, and we have a full page of exemptions from Tigard. So that's what is working in other communities right now, and it's in our presentation. So I'm not totally sure what more information you're looking for.
All right, well, at this stage, why don't we have staff go ahead and start preparing a draft proposal. It sounds like we have strong support for at least 60% and perhaps some support for more, along with some exemptions. And if you could start to draft up a proposal, then council can make changes from there. That way we have an actual document that we're working with.
So you want this scheduled for a future business meeting with those, with that, or for a workshop?
We may end up doing another workshop.
Another
but
workshop?
let's
Okay.
work on getting the draft first. All right. That said, let's flip back to American Rescue Act. Thanks for being here, Kelly and Jason.
All right. Good afternoon, Mayor, Council. I'm pleased to present the topic of American Rescue Plan Act allocation, also known as ARPA. With me shortly is Susan Clark, and she's our grant specialist. We'll be doing a tag team, and she'll be presenting the second half of this presentation, and I'll come back in at the end for the call to action. So, subject, summary, and goal is to discuss American Rescue Plan Act's potential use on and uses and potential survey, which is one thing council is wanting us to take a look at. Relationship to council goals, it highlights really all five. This is really broadened over time on what the potential allowable uses are, and so it really could touch on any of those goals. I'll be providing just a small reminder of where we are and what we're looking at. Our local allocations, we will be receiving a total of $9.3 million. We do have already 50% of that in. That was very responsive. About a week after our request, we did receive $4.6 million. The important thing about this is these funds really need to be allocated, or at least the intent of allocation with contracts sort of by the end of December 31st, 2024. So it's not something we can hold in the bank for a long time like we do our industrial loan fund dollars. This is something that is meant to be spent and inject in the community a relief due to COVID. As a refresher, just there are 4 pillars associated with this, and those guidelines include public health and economic impacts as the first pillar. The second pillar is premium pay for eligible workers. The third pillar is government services to the extent the reduction in revenues are due to COVID-19. And then the fourth pillar is water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. Just some general guiding principles. We've talked about these before, but we want to try to leverage outside funding opportunities, restore financial stability to future government operations, seek opportunities to make a lasting change in the physical or social infrastructure, ensure accountability and public participation, and that's one of the reasons why we're talking about the survey today. Funds are non-reoccurring, should be used and applied primarily to non-reoccurring expenditures, and align with council's strategic plan. So as you are probably aware, you've been getting some reports from your council president at business meetings associated with the American Rescue Plan Act and the County Task Force, as he is the representative member for that. They have established a citizen, business, local government representation. It does include the council president and myself who have been attending. It ensures accountability and public participation. They've developed some grant programs, evaluation criteria, and a grant award recommendations that they'll be going through. The first grant recommendations, I think, are going to go to the Board of Commissioners towards the end of September. Options that we've discussed to date have included economic support due to lost revenue for the business sector, and partner with So Ready to provide some resources through So Ready and their grant program that they already have in place. Public health, economic support, premium pay, public investments, affordable housing, and homeless reduction initiatives are some things that council's showed some interest in. or at least discussed. City revenue replacement, we're not eligible for this first round, but we may be in the future as we continue to track that, and we will. So next year, when we do some additional funds and look at reporting back to you, we'll determine whether or not we have the ability to apply for some of those lost revenues. And then water and sewer infrastructure, and with a focus on reduction of debt, which would provide some cost savings and reduce the amount of rates that you would need to adjust in order to help pay for the water treatment plant. Since that time, we've also been looking internally at some other options. For instance, in community development, what kind of affordable housing can we provide incentives for? Police, community violence intervention program potentially, or fire, personnel costs and staff reassigned to public health and in the city and the public sector, and we will be tracking that, as I mentioned. So just as a process that we've been following, looking at our guiding principles, assessing our current financial situation which we have. We've been coordinating with Josephine County and Cave Junction. We're talking about today citizen engagement opportunities, then determine priority uses, and then ultimately measure success and regular community reporting associated with the program. So the next steps, the expenditure plan. Do we partner with the county task force to include some of our resources to go along with and partner with the county? That is an option. We could develop an independent or some kind of additional process and prioritization for distribution. We can have some additional public outreach and input. We could do online surveys, creation of a task force, etc. Some of those things we'll be discussing today. And then council prioritization and recommendations. Where would you like to allocate those resources into the 4 pillars? And again, we have 2 allocations. The first is the $4.6 million, and we'll be receiving about another half of that. In another year, we'll be requesting for that amount. So that's just a general background, and the main focus of the presentation is not what I just provided you. That's just to set the stage for your future conversation and to let the community know where we are. This portion, the next portion of the presentation is going to be presented by Susan Clark. She is a PhD. She's done a lot of work at Boise State. She founded a number of different graduate and master programs, taught and researched design methods, statistics, GIS, economic development, and she also was a consultant for Sound Transit in Seattle, Washington. The neat thing about this is she is our grant specialist, but she comes with us with a doctorate and a lot of specialization, especially in surveys. So when we recognize that council was interested in potential surveys, we've got an expert in the field right here on staff, and so what better to have our local PhD, Susan Clark, provide you with some information on surveys.
So good afternoon, Mayor and City Council. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm looking for the...
Hey, Susan, just a quick note. Can you get up close to the mic? We have a couple people who are hard of hearing.
Not a problem.
Thank you.
Is that better? Okay. Okay.
Get it right up close to your mouth.
Closer. There we go.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks again, Erin. This presentation is in response to the City Council's request for a survey to help gather input into how the community might like to see us best spend, how they might like to see us prioritize spending the $9.3 million ARPA funds. For your consideration, I'm just going to briefly go over the ARPA goals. Erin really already did that. And talk a little bit about reporting. And then we're going to cover 3 kinds of survey methodologies for your consideration and look at a draft survey and talk about cost and timing and other considerations for community input. So the broad goals, as you know, are to meet the immediate COVID-19 related health, economic, and social changes, address long-term infrastructure and economic needs, and confront inequities made worse by the pandemic. So with reporting, I've already reported our work to date using ARPA funds, so I've reported 0 obligations and 0 expenditures, which is just fine for the moment. We do have annual reports that will be due. We only have this one interim report, so the annual reports will be due every July 31st, and we'll have quarterly reports coming up Our first will be in October, where we will report on our first 2 quarters. So the government's already asking for reporting. Additionally, I want to mention the Treasury is encouraging recipients to prominently share their plan and any relevant changes with the public on our website. So that's another thing we'll think about when it comes to considerations. So, in gathering information and community involvement in planning for the ARPA funds, this is an allowable expense. We can just charge all these community outreach things to the ARPA funds. And I'm going to put forth and discuss the pros and cons of 3 different survey methods to obtain household and business feedback for us on how we might prioritize those funds use. So the first one is a convenience survey, and this is probably the most common way agencies and businesses get input and feedback from the general population, is they put a survey up on a website and they direct people to it either using social media or flyers or newsletters or whatever. There are several drawbacks to this method. One of them is ballot stuffing, and ballot stuffing is where people go back over and over and take the survey trying to heighten what they think is most important, right? We can safeguard and prevent ballot stuffing to some degree. It's not foolproof, and it does require an excessive amount of data cleaning, and even then you're not sure you've done it well. Additionally, this method of using a convenience survey can lead to bias in the data because it elicits responses from people that may have particular characteristics, such as they may just simply like to take surveys, or they have access to the internet, or they are perhaps government information wonks and junkies, right? So we may not be hearing from a large cross-section of our community. And even if we do so, we may not know it because we haven't done a valid statistical sample, so we have no idea how representative those responses are of the population. Another method we could look at is a valid statistical sample. So this approach would entail a separate mailing to randomly selected households with a unique address, and a separate mailing to all active and inactive businesses within our city limits. The mailer would have a unique code for households and businesses, so they could use that code to take, that kind of helps us guard against ballot stuffing, and the survey would be online, and if, in case anyone were to elect to ask for it in paper copy, we could send it to them with their code, a postage-paid envelope, and we can send it in English or Spanish. We would then also have a thank you reminder postcard go out, and then the survey, as I mentioned, could be translated. So a survey with a valid statistical sample involves a random sampling, which means that everyone has the opportunity to be selected to participate, but it does not mean that they have the same, that everyone could actually participate. So in our case, we would be looking at drawing a sample from 14,220 households. But to get a statistically representative sample with a 95% confidence interval of plus or minus 5%, we only need 375 responses. So in order to get that response rate, we would be looking at mailing out about 1,200 surveys. That would, in essence, be about 8% of the households. I'm setting businesses aside right now for these numbers. So we might go back and send out a few more if in the amount of time we'd hoped we didn't get sufficient response. It's a very, very, very efficient method to get a valid sample. It's cost effective. And it's costs more, though, than a convenience survey, but you actually end up with some data that you can run some statistics on and have confidence in. So, but the drawback to it is not every household will have the opportunity to participate in the survey, only the sample that's selected. So a third option would be to do an all household and business survey. It would work just like the statistical sample approach, where there'd be a separate mailer in every way We could have it in English and Spanish, and we could include active and inactive businesses in the city limits. The statistical analysis that this sample or the valid statistical sample provides will allow the city council to know which items are truly a priority and permit additional analysis. So we could actually then go on and look at demographic characteristics and see which groups are choosing which options and what might be most relevant to which groups of people or businesses. So conducting the survey using an entire household and business population would permit everyone to have an opportunity, or every household and business to have an opportunity to voice their opinion on how they'd like to see the city prioritize the use of the funds. Although it costs more, the survey, as I mentioned before, these are allowable expenses. The potential drawback is if a third of everyone came and wanted paper surveys, which I truly doubt we'd even come close to that, I would anticipate a couple hundred that might have to be hand entered. But that's probably the biggest drawback to this approach. Since every household and business could participate, I would actually recommend this. Normally, as a former professor of statistics, I would lobby for the most cost-efficient method. But given that we have both the burden and the opportunity to spend $9.3 million on the future brightness of our community, it might be a great time to take stock of all the voices. I think that's really, okay. So, whoops, I went too far. Hang on. My apologies. I'm gonna just go back up. There we go. So regardless of the method we would choose, the survey content would primarily be the same, well, would be the same, if the goal is to understand what the community would like to prioritize for us to use the funds. In developing the content of the survey, and in your packet you have both these items. On the left is the survey, and then on the right is the list from which anything that's highlighted yellow from that list appears on the survey. So in developing the content for the survey, I looked to the reporting tool that the U.S. Treasury is asking us to use, and the Economic Development Administration has ARPA grants out there, and so some of the options that they're providing for spending the funding. So these are things that we legitimately know we can spend the money on. For the draft survey, Adam and I took a shot at identifying the areas and items that we thought would be most likely for our community. And it's a draft, and then the whole full list is in your Appendix A. On the first page of the survey, which is what you see here, is an introduction about the American Rescue Plan Act and some hyperlinks and places you can go to get additional information. If you go to the second page, I keep doing that, okay. If you go to the second page, it would look something like this. And basically what this is we would start the survey out with the 5 categories of spending, and then the respondent can select which one of these or all of these that they're interested in having the funds prioritized to. So once they do that, so you can select more than one, or you can just select 1 or 2. Once they do that, then the survey takes them to, because it's online, it would just go straight to one of these, or eventually all of them, if they choose all of them, topics. So if, for example, they chose supporting for public health needs due to COVID-19, then they would get the subcategories under that topic where they would prioritize. And we have a not a priority so that we're not giving something weight when someone doesn't even want it to have weight just by putting it as the last one. That's why there's not a priority. Being last isn't necessarily no interest. Those are really 2 different outcomes. So it would look something like this. Well, it would look like this. So then the other, so that's for each category. There's a subcategory. And then we would also have demographics. So I've included the following demographics, but we could certainly have fewer, or maybe a couple more, but we don't want to make the survey too onerous. The ones I'm recommending are gender identity, age, ethnicity, race, household size for the households, and number of employees for the employers, income for the households, and profit or loss for the employers. This is an example of the outcomes we would get from a survey. These are completely fictional numbers, but if on the first sheet, you could have selected more than one item. So what we're getting here in terms of an outcome is the items that are chosen the most frequently, because people can choose more than one option. And as you can see, it's a nice display of what is a higher priority. When you get to the subcategories and they have to rank, then you can see the number of people who are choosing, or the percentage of people who are choosing a particular option. Okay. But even though you have the priorities, the devil will still be in the details in determining how much money to spend on what and how to go about doing it. But at least you'll have an idea of where the community would like the city to focus in terms of putting us on a path to recovery and establishing some short and long-term social, economic, and structural gains for a brighter future. So other considerations include the survey implementation. So if we were to decide today to do the survey, we could have findings by Thanksgiving. If we push out 30 days, we could have findings by Christmas. If we push out further than that, I would say, let's wait until January, because we don't want to be doing this during the holidays. And then we would have results by March, April, depending on when we started in January. Other things to consider are that we could get more qualitative information if we wanted to, through meetings, focus groups, or we could do another survey narrowing in on the specifics after this survey. We could be conducting meetings concurrently if we wanted information now, or subsequently, we could be getting qualitative and quantitative information that would focus in on whatever it was that we learned from this survey that we wanted to delve into. And finally, as I noted previously, we will need to start thinking about a plan for our webpage. And with that, we can turn to the cost implications. So the convenience survey, the estimate I have for that is about $7,200. For the statistically valid survey, it's about $10,000. And for the all households and business survey, it's about $22,000. So as I mentioned before, these are allowable expenses under ARPA funds. And if we were to take the highest, even if we took the highest expense, that would be 0.0000002% of the $9.3 million. So it's not much. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Aaron. And I'm here for questions if there are any.
So from a call to action standpoint, what we're looking for from council is some direction with regards to the survey alternatives. Maybe you don't want to do a survey, and that's okay, but if you do, we've got some general information for you to provide us that direction, or any other alternatives, waiting on the survey, proceeding with options according to council priorities, or any kind of appropriation of resources to any of the pillars. And with that, Mayor, I turn it over to you.
Thank you. Do you have a question, DJ?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Could you clarify what your opinion for the most effective way to get the information we want?
So is my recommendation,
Yes.
because we don't have a cost concern in this case, would be to do the all household and business survey to get the most voices. And we can still run statistics and give us a confidence interval of 99% and plus or minus 1 or 2%, whatever it ends up being. But that would be my recommendation, is to get as many voices as you can and not worry about statistics running you astray.
Sure, yeah, statistical relevance is very important. And then you had mentioned additional outreach and options. So I guess doing a convenience survey as well might not be the best thing to do. So select one of those three and then perhaps utilize additional outreach. Because I think that would also be important, is to have statistical relevant data and then maybe community outreach or task force meetings or something else to kind of, you know, gather that what might be left. Is that accurate? Do you
Yes.
think? Okay.
And the value of the qualitative data is you get to know more about the why.
Yes.
And even though we have an other on all of those subcategories for people to write something in, we're not going to get the full picture. From our perspective, is just looking at data, we're going to say, oh, well, they want something to do with cafes, but we don't know why or how many, you know. So you'll get richer information from your qualitative work. Yes.
And it could be that having those survey results, then we could focus on some good forums to get that richer information to provide more information for you.
Understood. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Rick?
Thank you, Susan. So on the all households and business survey, what percentage, I realize even if you put a piece of paper in front of somebody and put a stamp on the envelope for them to mail it in, or you send them an electronic version, you're not going to hear from everybody. What type of percentage do you anticipate with the latter, the old house?
So we would hope a good return would be a third. That would be a third.
33%?
Yeah.
Whoa.
And that would be a good return. But it requires doing that, like that extra step, the reminder thank you note. If we did an all one to every household, we could actually add some social media. That might help a little too, just to make it a little broader known that it's important to the city. You know, hey, this is important. We can send it to the folks that are on our list or whatever. So,
Okay. Thank you.
Joel?
Susan, great job. It's just really nice. It's nice to listen to you. So I'm looking at the marginal differences between the sample and the 100% survey. Mm-hmm. And it seems like a very incremental cost. For that small additional cost, what are the advantages in terms of statistical reliability, in terms of social acceptance, in terms of feedback from the community do we get for that extra investment in mailing it out or getting it to 100% of our constituents?
So I think there's two ways to think about it. From a statistical perspective, you will get away from the 95% and get closer to 99%, right? And your margin of error will go down because you'll have well over the 375 threshold, right? I think in this case, when you have something, and this is my personal opinion you're asking for, in this case, when you have this much money that has so much promise for the community, and you have a community that has been impacted on a number of different levels, whether it be personally or their business or whatever, that it almost behooves us to try and get as many voices as we possibly can and to take as much in as we can.
Thank you, Susan.
Sure.
Any other questions? All right. Thank you, Susan. All right, as far as discussion, what do you want to talk about? Brian?
Thank you for the presentation, Susan and Aaron. So I want to take a step back from the survey and from the presentation and just kind of look at the big picture of the ARPA money for a second. We have 4.6 million right now. We're getting another 4.6 next year. Personally, I'm not even thinking about next year's 4.6. Like that's, well, you know, let's talk about that next year. We have 4.6 right now. Staff has presented us with an opportunity to use 1.5 of that this year to offset a rate increase for the water treatment plant. I have heard fairly broad support amongst counselors for that. So I think that one is a pretty strong candidate. After that, we have 3.1 million left. And I'm sure you all remember we had strategic planning at the beginning of the year, and we have a whole list of priorities, that we've already heard from the community about, and we already know exist. So why aren't we looking, we're talking about what the county's doing, we're talking about doing surveys, but we already have a list of priorities, like what on our strategic plan can we use this money for? We can use it for affordable housing. We can use it for addressing the homeless issue. So we already know the answers to a lot of what a survey would tell us. And I'm inclined to go with staff's recommendation for the water treatment plant and to utilize this money for items that have already been identified in our strategic plan.
Joel?
So how long does the survey take, and when would we know the results?
So if we decided to go with the survey that's proposed today, we would have some information. We would have the findings by Thanksgiving.
Thanksgiving, okay.
If we waited a month, we would have them by Christmas.
Okay, thank you.
Further discussion? Question, Valerie?
I just have a question. I think it's for Aaron more than anybody. How long has it been? I know we used to do surveys in the past. How long has it been that we've done any sort of survey of our constituents?
I would say probably 2015, maybe 2016. It's been a number of years.
DJ, then Brian, and then Joel.
Yeah, 3 million towards water treatment plant to me is just such a no-brainer, so there we go. Also, I'm in strong support of the recommended survey and moving forward with that. I think constituent input with this topic is just absolutely clutch. There's something to be said for, yes, we do have strategic planning, and yes, we have some issues to solve in this community, and we can talk a long time about what those issues are, but I have a strong desire to have statistical relevant data about what our constituent would like this money spent on.
Brian?
Yeah, I learned a lot about surveys today, and I have a question that may be a concern about the household and business survey. My concern, and I heard the benefits of it, and I'm not necessarily concerned with the cost of it, but my concern is that our constituents are residents of Grants Pass. Our constituents are not the businesses of Grants Pass, and I see the potential for business owners that live in Grants Pass to get to have 2 votes on a survey, where that would not be equitable to the other residents in Grants Pass. So I just wanted to voice that concern that I have with that lack of equity in that survey option.
Joel?
Well, one of the things I continually remind myself is we work for the citizens. And this is a new development, and to get their input on it is not a bad thing. The other thing that I've learned, and I've seen it the last 2 years, I've actually seen it over the last 40 years of my career, social acceptability. Sometimes you need to go slow up a little bit to stop and actually respect people and ask them what they're thinking, so that when they give us their input, it needs to be considered, and it helps then increase. I guess they agree. It helps increase the social acceptability of what we recommend. Without that social acceptability, you end up with, as we know in some of the things that have come up in the community, things don't get resolved, and then it takes a lot of energy, and we don't need to do it that way. So that's why I would like to do the survey, get on with it as quick as possible, because there are some urgent needs. And as we consider the public input, we also look at the strategic plan. That's obviously a tool that we can still look at. and we work for these people. So I want to know what they're thinking in this opportunity.
Kurt, then Valerie.
I'm just going to say that in my career, I've done a number of marketing surveys, and I'm just going to say, be careful what you ask for. And I'm somewhat in support of what Brian said, and of course, I think the water plant is an obvious thing as well.
Valerie.
Well, I'm going to say that I agree that the water plant is one that has jumped out at me, that has said, yes, that would reach the base of our majority of our constituents. But I'm also going to say that public and what the public has to say is important to me. And I think this is such a small percentage of the amount of money that it's well worth reaching out and helping, letting everyone feel they at least have a voice to put down what they think. So I am in favor of doing this survey.
Any other comments? Vanessa and Rob out there?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. This is Vanessa.
Hi, Vanessa.
Thank you, Susan, for all of that information. That was wonderful. I also am in support of moving forward with a survey. I don't necessarily feel strongly one way or the other about either the all households and business survey or the Ballot Statistical sample survey. I think either would be sufficient. This economic infusion from the federal government is an opportunity that hasn't happened in decades. In a lot of our lifetimes, the federal government unfortunately just does not invest in local communities like they used to. So I think that this provides an opportunity for the community to have their voice heard and to get involved in such an exciting time. So I would be in support of moving forward with that. I am in support of the survey implementation timeline as well. And I did really enjoy the mention of additional outreach options. I would like to see some remote town halls held, especially with the COVID-19 surge that we're experiencing right now. Very similar to what we do when we do plan for our strategic planning, when we have that community forum. So I would like to see that done as well, so that we can, like Susan said, have that wide variety of voices. Because although we did do strategic planning, and I am in support of consistently reviewing that document, I think that was done in consideration of a time where maybe we are moving through the pandemic, whereas now we are, at ground zero, unfortunately, in Josephine County for the pandemic. So I think that there are issues that have arisen since strategic planning that maybe are not considered in that document that our community could voice their concerns on.
Rob?
Yeah, thank you. I'm definitely in favor of moving forward with the survey, and I'd like to do the most extensive, basically the third option, the most extensive survey, and as essentially as soon as possible. I think it's going to be valuable to us. I think without it, we're to some degree kind of shooting in the dark. This at least basically allows us to kind of drive at night with our headlights on and get a good sense of where the people are on it. Thank you.
DJ, then Brian, then Rick.
Sure, household and businesses. I couldn't disagree with you more, Brian, about your statement of households are who we represent and not businesses. Businesses are constituents. They do pay city taxes, they pay fees, and they contribute greatly to this community. And I can't agree with anything that was said about not wanting to know what businesses have to say, other than the potential duplication. But we have an expert in statistics here that I'm sure can address that concern.
Brian.
Yeah, thank you for providing that clarification, DJ. And just to clarify my position on that particular survey, Obviously, businesses contribute greatly to our community. We wouldn't have a community without them. But my point is like, let's take Rob, for example. Rob's going to get a survey at his house that he can vote on. He's going to get a survey at his business that he can vote with too. And Rob's just one person. So, you know, and as for me, I'm only going to get one survey. So I think Rob, if we didn't do the businesses, Rob would be using his residential survey to take into account his business and his, you know, citizen life, I guess. But again, just to be clear, businesses don't vote for counselors. Businesses are not our constituents. The citizens are our constituents, and if they happen to own a business in Grants Pass, they would take their business into account in filling out the survey. So, you know, that said, I would probably prefer the valid statistical sample survey. As I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, that it would probably be 95% accurate, give or take, compared to, you know, the other one, which might be 99%, but the margin of error there is pretty small.
Did you want to say anything, Susan? And come back up to the mic before you talk.
Yes, I did. Thank you. Just a couple things as I'm listening to the discussion, just for your consideration. One is when we do the analysis, we can do the analysis and say, okay, this is what households think, this is what businesses think, this is what inactive businesses think. We can do just households. We don't have to do businesses and inactive businesses. We can, those are minor changes because it doesn't really change much on the survey. And then the other one, when I think about the water treatment plant, one thing the city of Detroit did, I did research on what other cities were doing, was they said the city of Detroit has spent X amount of money, there's this amount of money, how do you think we should prioritize this amount of money? So that's another option, and that's really just a change in the heading, because we can still leave the rest of the survey. We can still leave all the infrastructure there, because maybe they think it's even a greater priority, or they still think it's a priority and they're reaffirming what we're doing. So I want you to know there's options, that just what I presented is not all or none. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. Rick, and then Joel.
I'm also in favor of proceeding with one of the two surveys, and also the water treatment plant. I'm fully supportive of that. The one thing I just want confirmation, we were sent a sample survey before today, and I didn't know if we would receive the final version, the final draft version before it's sent out, just to provide additional input.
Yes, Rick, if you have some input, we'll get to that after we decide to do a survey, okay? Joel?
Well, Susan, thank you for the clarification. And so what I heard from Brian was that there could be some people that would be surveyed twice, one as a business and one as a resident. And then what I heard from Susan was she compiled the results by residents. So we'll have the results by residents where everyone gets one survey, and we'll have what we want there. And then we'll also have another result from businesses, that commercial part of our community. And I think both would be useful. We can sort out what that would be. And then we would have a total between the two. So there are two circles within at least two circles within our community. There's the residents and there's the businesses. It'd be nice to know in both circles what their priorities are. They may not be the same. And they'll give us a unbiased sample of what the residents would like, you know, because you don't vote twice as a resident. And then the businesses would have some additional information. So I would go for the complete survey, given the cost, and have it, Susan, so that we would have those two populations at least. And and I know you'll have more populations than that, given your expertise. And I think it would be a good tool for us.
All right, it sounds like we have really strong support for doing the citywide survey with results broken down by businesses and residents. Would council agree with that? Okay. Do you want to go ahead? It sounds like.
Yes, Mayor.
Thank you, Vanessa. Pipe up, Rob, if you don't agree. How about that? if I'm saying something wrong, stop me. As far as the water treatment plant, I've heard strong support for $3 million towards the water treatment plant. Do you want to go ahead and vote on that at this time? Do you want to wait? Joel?
So what's the effect if we wait until we get the results of the survey on the water treatment plant? What's the consequences of delaying that decision until we get the results back from the survey?
I suppose if this results came back that nobody wanted money spent on infrastructure.
Well, we still could make that decision.
You
though,
could still make that decision.
Yeah. And
Likewise.
you would know what the bosses are saying.
Right, so I guess if you wanted to take that off the table now, you could. Likewise, I guess if everybody wanted 100% of the money to be spent on infrastructure, water, sewer, then you could reevaluate, but.
So what I hear you saying then, Sarah, it's really, the consequences may be political if the population doesn't support it. In terms of the water treatment plan and the economics, there's really no difference. So it would be purely political depending on what our support is for spending the dollars that way.
I think at this point, we all heard a presentation where a strong case was made for how it saves every single constituent in the city money if we were to put at least $3 million towards the water treatment plant. They are not going to have the depth of knowledge about that subject and the implication on how it will help. So I think if you're ready to commit $3 million, you may as well do that and take it off the table. If you feel like there's still discussion for spending more or less of it, go ahead and wait. But I haven't heard anybody talk about spending more or less of it personally, so.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's what I was wondering, the amount, yeah, and the priority with our bosses. Okay, thank you.
Rick?
I've already had some minor impact or input from people saying they would be supportive of the water treatment plant reducing the fees, so I think if we want to step forward, I'm already initially comfortable with doing that.
Mayor, this is Adam.
Okay.
Oh, hey, Adam.
Hello, if I may, as far as the economic impact of waiting, from staff's perspective, you can make that determination whenever you like. However, the earlier council makes that decision to invest ARPA dollars into the water fund, we can just take that into consideration for whenever, with bond counsel and underwriting. Not that that's happening this month or anything, but the sooner that happens, the better position we'll be in to analyze potential debt issuance.
Does it matter, Adam, whether we were to put $1.5 million forward this year and $1.5 million forward next year, or do $3 million upfront?
Jason, correct me if I'm wrong, but based on the timeline of expenditures, I don't think it would have a very large effect for us at all, other than that same consideration of being able to present to underwriters that we have $3 million dedicated to this project from ARPA versus we only have 1.5 and probably another 1.5 after we get the other amount.
I agree with that, especially if we had some action that said, yes, we're dedicating 3 million, 1.5 this year, 1.5 next year. We'll just work it into the math and it'll be good.
Valerie?
I'm going to go ahead and make a motion that we do, because I agree with what Rick said. Everybody I have talked to is into lowering, not having to have the impact of those 2 water increases. And I think that, to explain that on this would be far too difficult. But we've had the presentations that shows the difference between having to have those 2 water increases, and we know how impactful that is on all of our citizens. And so I would make a motion that we take that $3 million off and do the survey for the remaining $6 million.
Okay, so the $3 million would be to support the water treatment. Do you want to specify whether it's $1.5 million of the first years or not?
No, I don't think it matters. I think you just say $3 million of the $9 million, and then it's 1.5 and then 1.5. It's what makes sense to me.
Okay, are you seconding, Rick? Rick with the second, thank you. Is there discussion on the motion? All right, so we're going to...
Yeah, this is Vanessa.
Go ahead, Vanessa.
Yeah, I thank you, Adam, also for your statement. That was the exact question that I was wondering, was kind of the timeline or the need for us to be taking a vote today. I am very uncomfortable voting on allocating these resources prior to hearing from the community in a formal sense. I do appreciate that some counselors have had conversations with folks, as have I, but I am very uncomfortable allocating such a large chunk of these funds without actually going through any outreach process beforehand. And I am becoming concerned with the increased amount of votes in our workshops. It is in our city council handbook that votes are typically not done in workshops, although they are. I do understand the legality of them. It is outlined in our handbook that they're not currently done in that way. So I am not comfortable with this motion, and for that I will be voting no. That does not mean that I do not support the water treatment plant funding with ARPA funds. It just means that I am uncomfortable with this process.
All right, thank you. Any further discussion?
Hi, this is Rob.
Hi, Rob.
Hi. I would have to say that if there's any one thing that's been incredibly consistent since January, it's the public's desire to have the council do whatever's possible to lower our water rates. And I don't think that there's any debate about that. There has been nobody that's said anything other than, geez, what in the world can you guys do to help us with reducing the water rates? So, while I understand getting more input will essentially solidify that in some councilors' minds, it's already very solid in my mind that that's what the public wants from us. Thank you.
All right, any further discussion? All right, Valerie, you made the motion. The motion would be to put $3 million of the 9 ARPA funds towards water treatment plan and take it off the table for the survey. How do you vote?
Yes.
Joel?
Yes.
Rick?
Yes.
Kurt?
Yes.
Brian?
I agree with Vanessa. I'm not comfortable with making votes on motions and workshops in such a laissez-faire fashion as we have been, so I'll be abstaining.
All right, and DJ?
Yes.
Vanessa?
No.
And Rob?
Yes.
All right, so it passes 5, 6, 1, 1. 6, 1, 1. All right. As far as the survey goes, so we're going to have a version that's residential, a version that's business, or at least collect the results separately. And I think it might be nice just to have a few sentences at the top that explain that a portion is going towards the water treatment plant, and that is intended to save everyone in the city from some of those additional water rate increases. As long as we're sending something to everybody, it's nice to get the word out about how we're saving them money. As far as the survey goes, yeah, Vanessa.
I'm so sorry if I keep interrupting you. I think there's a bit of a lag here. Before we get off the topic of surveys, I did also want to say, Susan, thank you for bringing up the fact that the survey could be available in both English and Spanish. I think we do know that the pandemic has affected everybody, but it has disproportionately impacted low-income families and communities of color. So I would like to see it available in both English and Spanish, or anyone's language of choice.
Thank you. The next thing I was going to ask was about suggestions for the survey itself. So that was timely. Rick, I think did you have some sort of suggestion about the survey itself, or a change to this draft, or is everybody comfortable with the draft?
I guess I would just want to look at it one more time, and then I can send an email back if I have any suggestions or concerns. Thank you.
Okay. Why don't you, everybody, just if you have specific comments or questions, get back to Aaron and Susan about that, and then if there's any substantial changes, just let us know. Thank you. All right, anything further about ARPA We are going to, I guess, do you want to wait for survey results, as far as how we move forward, or are there other issues that you want us to explore over the course of the next couple months? Joel?
So I'm just thinking aloud with you, Sarah. One of the homeless things that strike me is the mental illness and the substance abuse. And at least when we were in medical practice, those services in our community were not adequate. And having camps of those populations without those services really doesn't do them justice. And so I would like just for information from the community health, Public Community Health Committee that's joint between the county and the city, if they could give us the existing situation associated with mental health services and drug addiction services, and then what the future looks like in terms of increasing them and what the probabilities are and how can we help that. Because if we don't, as a community, progress in that area, I don't think it makes much difference with the homeless what we do if we don't have those services. And the same thing like with COVID, our kids, or there's other reasons as well. We've had people in our practice that were addicted to heroin, to painkillers, and they had to go to Medford if they made it, and sometimes they didn't make it. And we had a psychologist embedded in our medical practice at the request of options, and that just with our patients, that psychologist made a heck of a difference. But we have a shortage of psychologists in Grants Pass and mental health people in Grants Pass. So I would just like to have an update on what that looks like, just to accentuate that issue. Because I think as we move forward, if we really want to manage our populations in a progressive way that serves them, we have to address it. Otherwise, we'd be negligent.
All right, in regards to your question, because this did come up under agenda review as well, are you looking at mental health and addictions, kind of public health information specifically related to homeless, or just what's available in the community in general?
Well, I think homelessness is obviously a part of it, but the community in general is a part of it also. The Medicaid population is a part of it. The Medicare population is part of it. The depression, the COVID situation with kids. We've had several young people commit suicide. It's just a need across all our populations, I think. And in terms of, we got community resources that are trying to address that. And I just don't know what the status is, what the future is. Are there grants out there that we can help them get or not? And, in terms of partnerships with nonprofits that can make things even more effective. Okay. Whether it's with our schools, with the homeless population, with the older population, whatever. So. Okay. We did also have part of the original plan for today under the ARPA discussion was supposed to be some recommendations from the Housing Advisory Committee about how we might use ARPA funds to make progress on our housing situation. So they were not able to meet this past month, so we didn't have recommendations from them, but I'm going to assume that's something that council is still interested in learning about as we move forward. And then urban campground or homeless may be part of this discussion as well going forward. All right, anything else on ARPA for today? All right.
Mayor, do you see this as an appropriate time for counselors to be providing, I suppose, their direction on where they think the funds should be allocated, or is that for a separate day?
I mean, I think at this point, if we're doing a survey, to some degree, we need to wait before deciding how to allocate the funds. But if you have something that you'd like staff to be gathering information about, I think that time is kind of the essence because we don't have forever to figure out how to spend everything. So I'm not sure how that works in with what you're thinking.
I'm not really sure either, so I think I'll take a stab in the dark.
Okay, go.
I will second I'll second Counselor King's sentiment that mental health services are desperately needed. That is outlined in the Appendix A that we received as a possibility. I would like to explore the housing front, of course, and let's see here. That could look like a lot of things. That could be acquisition strategies to transfer, to acquire land, and then transfer it to community ownership or nonprofit ownership, stewardship. That could be as far as establishing a community land trust as recommended by the Housing Advisory Committee in their action plan, or land banks. Could use those recovery dollars to support nonprofits and their processes of making affordable housing possible for community members. So very strongly on the housing front. I would like to have staff do some research into implementing a weatherization program for homeowners, 30 to 50% of local AMI. A technical assistance grant for digital literacy for small businesses in the community. We are seeing a shift in that direction. And a mixed use development study that was mentioned by Mr. Love when he came and did his presentation on the downtown reconfiguration, that in itself would be its own study outside of the downtown reconfiguration, but he did say that that would be worth exploring. So I would like to see that considered. And lastly, a second water emergency response trailer for residents south of the river.
Okay, good ideas. Thank you. We'll add that to our list for the next time that ARPA comes back up. I think it is something that we just need to keep talking about ideas over the course of the next couple months and not put everything on a total standstill until we get those survey results. But obviously we want to refrain from getting too deep into the decision making before we get the feedback. Alrighty. Next up, creating a fire chief position. It looks like Aaron is heading over to the podium to present.
Good afternoon, Mayor, Council. Subject to summary today is a potential amendment to the city's existing classification plan with the addition of a new job description of fire chief. This supports the goals of leadership, maintaining city operations through appropriate staffing to improve our ability to deliver fire and first responder services in the community to better meet the needs and expectations of our citizens. So I just want to give you just some general background. We currently, as you are aware, have a public safety department that consists of a combined police, fire, support services, dispatch, 911. And back in 1984, it was created as a public safety department. The intent of that back in the mid 80s is there was a drive to try to do this new thing or newer thing and try and push towards public safety, where there was a lot of cross-training that was involved with both police and fire, and you would have a police officer / firefighter that would go and respond to emergency calls, whether it be a police initiative or a fire initiative or even an EMS issue, which even created additional service level concerns, trying to intermix all three of those things. So implementation of cross-training and providing dual services really was determined not to be a very effective means of delivering police and fire services. Number of entities did not continue it. Some of them continued it, and with some success. There are some, I think there's one in California that has a public safety department, and there's a couple of other ones, and they are doing an okay job with that. And then there's some that have done sort of what we did and had sort of a hybrid approach, where we tried to take some of the administration and do a dual role, but ultimately the true delivery of service was truly fire and truly police. Nominal implementation does exist today with some of those mergers, as I mentioned. So why am I coming to you for this request to create a fire chief? Well, from a timing perspective, let me answer that. It's not really in the slides, but we have the retirement of our current deputy chief, Chief Johnson, and he's retiring after. Lang is retiring after multiple years, decades of service to our community, both in rural metro and with the city. And we're looking at needing to recruit a new, technically, deputy chief. And when the chief and I, the current Warren and I, were sitting down and talking and trying to figure out recruitment strategies, recognizing that it's going to be extremely difficult to recruit for a deputy chief in a public safety organization, as if you look at the roles and responsibilities of the deputy chief and the way we're set up, it truly is a fire chief. So someone would be saying, I'm going to be applying for a deputy chief role, I'm going to be getting deputy chief pay, but I'm basically the fire chief. And so recruitment would be a very difficult thing. So timing, this is why we're coming to you now. This is not something that's new or has just been a light that's been turned on. This is something that administrative staff has been thinking about and talking about for a number of years, is the public safety department versus police and fire. So why the justification? Part of it is the environment that we're in right now, recruitment, retention, the potential and ability to realistically get a deputy chief that truly is a fire chief, but being paid and being titled as just a deputy chief. It also, some of the benefits of having a fire chief is it would provide the city manager an opportunity to have closer interactions with staff on policy and operational questions facing these two vital public services. I would have a direct line in communication with a fire chief that would be coming to me on a regular basis. We'd be having one-on-ones just like I have with public safety chief currently right now. It would be more specialized with fire, so they would have more of an equal representation coming to the table with those two service levels of service. It would increase the stature of these operations in the community. Truly would. You'd have a police department, you'd have a fire department. From the optics standpoint, that stature would be there. This is the city's fire department. The expanding responsibilities in both police and fire divisions from a technical standpoint, from a community desire and need, the way things are changing, our external, internal environments, are creating a lot of highly specialized technical work to be created. And having an individual at a chief level, like a fire chief, to be able to focus on these things really is an ideal situation, just looking long-term and what our community might need. So the deputy chief functions truly, as I mentioned, as a fire chief in all respects, except for senior city administrative and city council involvement. The deputy chief also fills the role of fire rescue administrative chief and operations chief for the division, completing budget assignments, annual reporting, payroll management, labor relations, purchasing, special projects, large incident management, ensuring response readiness of all divisions in all respects. Truly does operate as a fire chief. Because the deputy chief is really taking on a lot of the roles as a fire chief, it means that something has to give. And that means some of the deputy chief's roles and responsibilities are brought down to the battalion chiefs and the fire marshals. And then some of their roles have to be taken up for deputy chief roles, which means some of the battalion chief roles and the fire marshal roles are picked up by our lieutenants and our engineers and our firefighters, which is all good in a high-performing organization when everyone is a leader and they have responsibility and authorities. But it also does, though, weaken potentially the really fully 360 review with council policy focus on long-range planning, which is something that I think we can in the future benefit from with that focus from the creation of a fire chief. Many of the administration projects and programs also take a little more time sometimes, because some of the stuff that's normally worked on by a battalion chief or the deputy chief or what would be a fire chief goes to some of our shift staff, which means they get to work on it for a little bit and then it stops. And then maybe 4 days later, they get to come in and work on it again. So just the continuum of getting timely responses back to administration and or council, I think could be improved also. So how would this work? Because, and what does it look like budget-wise and et cetera? So let me talk through this with you. What we'd be looking at is hiring a fire chief to manage fire and rescue operations, similar to the police chief, who would then be managing police chief operations and 911 and support operations. So 911 dispatch support would stay under Chief Hinsman. Fire chief would be responsible for fire and first responder activities. We would not fill an open fire inspector position. That is currently, we've decided at this point to not fill that, because what we'd be looking at is maybe taking that open position and transitioning into a fire chief position, which is why I'm asking for this today. So in the short term, and potentially even the long term, it may not require a full new FTE, but I'm not saying that that's the case, because I would like to have some more time, if we do this, with a new fire chief to talk through what is the appropriate span of control when it comes to the fire department and everything we do. So we would not fill that in fire inspector position. We do believe that would not hinder our services much. We may see a small decrease in the annual inspections, but we do not see that as something that would be a detriment to the community. We would not fill the deputy chief position. This would give the new fire chief an opportunity to recruit and hire their own deputy chief or some kind of division chief based on the conversations that myself and the fire chief have on what the true need is of that department. So we'd fund the fire chief position using the savings from the open fire deputy chief position and the fire inspector position. The fire chief and the city manager we would over a 6-month period determine, refine and communicate a clear strategic plan for fire rescue and what that would look like. Future considerations in fiscal year 23 could be something that other communities do that I think would be a very big benefit to us, is to place emergency management under fire rescue services to provide additional services and focus. This could provide us with the opportunity to utilize some of our $80,000 resources that we have currently in contract for emergency services with the county to transition that into fire and offset any costs of actually creating a fire chief position. And then sometime in fiscal year 23, we'd hire a deputy chief or fire division chief or something along those lines based on what the true need is after we've made that determination. So what are the essential duties? I won't go through this whole list, but really the essential duties of a fire chief is the implementation of policy and operational goals. It's that, and being able to have that direct line of communication with city manager and with city council. True supervision and management of all of the support staff. They'd be preparing presentations, they'd be doing budget, they'd be taking care of all of the community meetings and those associated with that. They would be also establishing the annual goals for the department in association with the strategic plan. And they would also be, of course, involved with strategic planning, just like all the department directors are. And they would also be at the X team level also. So cost, talked a little bit about the timing and why now is a good time. Talked a little bit about the reasons why we truly really have an operational fire and police department, but it's still labeled as public safety. What we would do is we'd not fill the inspector and replace it with the fire chief. We'd leave the deputy chief open until 6 months or so into it. The fire inspector salary is all in, including total compensation is $135. The fire chief would be $198. and the difference is total all-in $63,000. So without creating a new FTE, but just replacing the fire inspector position, not filling that, and then taking that and filling a fire chief role, we'd be looking at an increase of about $63,000, which for the future could be offset with emergency management being rolled over into the fire department, which I think is an excellent match. Even with this additional cost, I do see benefit to having a fire chief with that specific focus that we have, but even a more specific focus with all the new needs that are coming within the community. So ultimately, as city manager, I'm asking you for your consideration to create a fire chief position, and you can provide direction to create that, and we would move it to a business meeting through putting it on the consent calendar or putting it on a future business meeting, or you can choose not to approve the position and continue as a public safety department. And with that, Mayor, I turn it over to you for questions.
Thanks, Aaron. I have a quick question just on the previous slide where it says at the bottom, Public Safety Director and the pay range there. Is that just for comparison purposes against the Fire Chief 126,000?
It is. I put that in there because I figured the question would be asked, well, what's the fire chief, what's the police chief get paid? And ultimately the responsibilities are almost identical. So they would be in the same salary schedule as the current Public Safety Director.
Thanks. What other questions? Joel?
Just real quick, and it's probably pertinent to this discussion. Kurt and Rick, you showed me a text where South Tahoe is being evacuated as we speak, and Tahoe may be burning down. Anyway, what I heard you say was that leadership is important. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then what I heard you say is that there's some emerging issues in the fire, that it's becoming more and complex, and there's a lot of coordination with our neighbors that needs to be done. A lot of strategic planning, like we talked about evacuation routes earlier this year, that needs to be done. And as we discuss those, we need to honor the existing leadership and what they've done, because I don't see this as being a negative thing on them at all. But what I hear you saying, and you correct me if I'm wrong, that leadership is important in emergency services, and you would like to improve the leadership even more and pay them what it's worth so you get a quality person.
Yeah, this does not reflect the ability of our current leadership team.
Mm-hmm.
This is our leadership team trying to bring forward a recommendation to council that we believe will better serve the community, and does not, from my perspective, I'm not bringing this forward because there is a lack of leadership within the team. This is for the betterment of the community.
Well, and what I see, now you may correct me, is this a reactive suggestion, or is this a looking ahead strategic, trying to take care of things before they occur?
So this is strategic. We've been thinking about it for a while, and it's a timing thing also, and now the timing is right. But not only because of the departure of our current deputy chief, but also with a realignment of priorities through council. So much of what we realigned a few months ago was focused on fire prevention, fire mitigation, et cetera. And providing a chief to be able to focus on some of those high priority goals of council, I think would be beneficial, and we would see a better return, a quicker return, a more thorough return on your goals.
Rick and then Valerie.
Thank you, Aaron. Can you go back to slide 10 with the, okay. So on there, I really like the idea. I think it has a lot of merit. But one question I have on the $63,000 difference, if we're to move forward with that, where would that money come from? And could it also come from the next fiscal year to make up the difference? Or what do you foresee would be the method?
From a budget standpoint, this fiscal year, with leaving the fire inspector position open and not hiring the fire chief for 6 months, we would have more than enough money budgeted currently right now with any kind of budget adjustments necessary. And then that would also provide us enough time moving forward to take a look at emergency management and potentially folding that into the fire department and first responders.
Valerie, then DJ.
Yeah, that was kind of somewhat similar to my question, because I knew that you had talked about the fire inspector's wages, and then you had talked earlier about there being the 6 months of not hiring the fire deputy's wages. So that was a little bit misleading, because I couldn't quite figure out how that was there. But I'm assuming now then that we know that our fire inspector has retired and it is an open position. Am I correct? Or how is that?
Yes, that's correct. The
Okay,
chief
so
is
there
shaking his head.
currently is- yes.
It is an open position
It is an open position at this time.
that we have not filled.
We have not filled. And that our deputy fire chief, who has been acting as a fire chief, we all know in our hearts for quite a while, is retiring.
End of this month.
At the end of this month. Okay, so that helps understand that 6 months of that position and the fire inspector will come together to make the budget work for us, correct?
And then some, yes.
And then some. Okay, thank you. And in all regards, thank you for all you've done.
DJ.
So, I've known for a long time this decision and why. And you did a really good job describing kind of the impacts and the change in duties. Just clarifying, are we talking about more or less director level? Can we expect a fire chief to be sitting in on council meetings? That was one thing said, that currently the deputy doesn't have that involvement with council. So
Thank you for that clarity, and I think it's actually an important part of the clarity also, so I appreciate the opportunity to address that. The fire chief would be at this table on the dais and at the strategic planning, et cetera, which I think from a council's perspective would be very valuable, because you'd have that specific focus and that specific relationship with that department also.
Okay, I also think that would be valuable, and it's interesting how you had mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that this is just nominal. We effectively operate as you're proposing in some way. Now, whereas we would have a fire chief, currently Warren is the director of public safety. Is there a difference then in hierarchy structure as of this motion, or are we talking in eventually a complete separation of the two and backing off of the whole public safety model that we started in '84?
So, yeah, we'd be backing off from the public safety model, and we would be going to a police and fire department. The police chief, which would be Warren Hintzman, would be in charge of police and 911 dispatch. The fire chief would be responsible for fire and first responder.
Got it. Thank you.
How many fire inspectors do we have?
Currently, we have one plus the fire marshal. We just had Tim Stacy that resigned and he went to ODF.
So if the fire inspector position is vacant and we're not refilling it, what happens?
Right now, we've actually seen a huge decline in our inspections because of COVID. So we've kind of taken a look back at what we've done over the last year and a half, and we've kind of identified efficiencies within prevention. And although we do believe we could bolster prevention, we do think the operational side of fire rescue is most important right now. We do feel we'll be able to maintain our responsibilities to the community with one prevention and one fire marshal, and also too utilizing some additional technology, some additional availability of software products so we can be more efficient in the field, so we can do our inspections and finish the paperwork in the field versus coming back to the station to do the paperwork.
Any other questions, Brian?
Yeah, Aaron, could you go back to the previous slide? So just with regards to the salary schedule for the public safety director and the fire chief, did you say that those would be essentially the same schedule?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm curious why the fire chief salary is showing, it's showing towards the upper end of that schedule. And I'm just wondering, wouldn't the fire chief probably...
Sure. The fire chief, I think, is down one from the police chief because of the additional responsibilities in the schedule.
Okay, so the fire
So the
chief
all-in
down
is 126 for the fire chief, the all-in, salary-wise, and the all-in for the public safety director police chief would be 137.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah.
And then just one more clarification. I'm just trying to figure out, because there's kind of a little bit of a shuffle happening. And so the 63,200 is just the cost difference between the fire inspector and the fire chief, correct?
Yeah, that's at top levels.
Okay, so how's that going to play in the next fiscal year when we add the deputy chief back in? Are we going to need to find more funding for that position, or is that something that we're just not filling and it's going to be refilled at that point?
So the deputy chief, like fiscal year 23, we'd be looking at filling maybe a deputy chief or some other type of position based on where the fire chief and myself would move forward in the future. But then also my firm recommendation at this point, unless something else goes different, is that we'd be rolling emergency management as a responsibility under fire, which would provide an additional $80,000 revenue also to come into fire without an increase in potentially FTE.
Okay, so the $80,000 from emergency management would more than cover this difference on the slide. But as far as the difference for next fiscal year, we'll have to identify another funding source for that deputy chief position. Is that correct?
No, the deputy chief position would still be funded just like it is now. The deputy chief position, we'd be funding for next year, so there wouldn't be any need for additional funds for the deputy chief.
Great, thank you.
Can you please clarify, Aaron, how emergency management works now?
Currently, right now, we have a contract that we've been in for 4 years now with the county that provides for additional emergency management services that focuses on the city, and we pay $80,000 a year for that.
So if we were to not contract with the county, how do you foresee the fire department taking that over?
Yeah, the fire department, the role of emergency management and emergency manager would fit under the title of, say, the fire chief, and there would be specific emergency management focus coming from fire and first responders. It's a very common practice within a lot of municipalities that emergency management operations all fall under fire. They're the ones that have the training, expertise, and the ability to do that. This is one of the things that we've been blessed with Deputy Chief Johnson here with regards to the community and what he's been able to do for all of our wildfires, et cetera. He's got amazing experience being an emergency manager, in essence, for our community also.
DJ?
Yeah, following up with Sarah's questions, moving forward into like emergency management and having that in-house per se, would you expect any adjustments within fire, additional FTE or equipment or otherwise to be able to handle that at this time?
Equipment-wise, that's too far out for me to really determine. I think from a perspective, I'd be looking at more of a focus from an incident management response team that we would have present, and we would have the leader of that housed under fire. So that role and responsibility would fall under the fire chief, and the fire chief could be that emergency manager, or it would be the designee potentially, which could be the deputy chief.
Understood. Thank you.
Further questions? Joel?
Well, the other thing I heard you say, I think, you correct me, that the emergency management funding resulting in that position of the deputy chief, that also, in terms of interagency cooperation, doesn't really take away from the county because of the way our mutual aid, the way we respond to incidents, they would be available in an emergency to assist other agencies just as those other agencies are available to assist us. So there would still be that collaboration that perhaps at an even increased level.
Actually, from a continuum of services standpoint, emergency management wise, it would be a multiplier from the standpoint of strength, as we would have multiple individuals within Josephine County that are prepared and ready to be an emergency manager if the need comes.
Further questions? Vanessa and Rob, any questions?
I have none. Thank you, Mayor.
All right.
No, thank you.
Okay, we'll move on to discussion. And I just want to make sure council understands clearly what we're talking about here would be to separate out the Department of Public Safety and have a fire chief and a police chief, eliminating the inspector position. So this new chief and the fire marshal would need to take that position on, as well as potentially in the future eliminating the emergency management contract with the county and having the chief or other fire staff take on those duties. So a lot of shifting things going on in this discussion. Brian and then DJ.
I think that all sounds good. I'm ready to take it to a business meeting.
DJ?
Yeah, I'm fortunate to have been involved with this decision-making process and the logic, in my opinion, that just logic abounds. This makes so much sense, and I agree. I would take this to a business meeting for consideration.
Joel?
And it also follows the model that almost all the communities in Oregon are following now, with the complexity both on the police and the fire, both increasing in complexity. And that expertise and leadership makes a difference, as we've seen with good leadership that we've had.
Valerie?
I would agree. In the time that I've been on council, I have seen definitely the level of both the police and the fire come to a whole new level, with the police and what they're doing drug-wise in our community, and with the, working with some of the marijuana issues, as well as fire and the fire danger that we've seen escalating. I think, it's been building, and this is the prime time to make it happen. So I'm in favor of moving it to a business meeting.
Anybody else with comments? All right.
Yes, Mayor, this is Vanessa.
Go ahead, Vanessa.
Just to jump on what everybody else, I do agree with everyone, what every other counselor has said. I am in support of moving this forward as well. I think this would further strengthen our public safety professionals in the community.
All right, council, are you interested in having it on the agenda this week? I'm seeing yes from Rick, yes from DJ, yes.
Do you need a motion on
From
that?
Joel? No, we'll just add it to this week's business meeting under council action for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor, Council.
All right, it's 2:30, Aaron. Do you think we can do legal services before we need to move on to our discussion with Aaron?
I think we can.
Okay.
My presentation's relatively short. It's not a change in level of service, it's just a change in the way we do the service that I'm recommending, so.
Okay, let's move forward then with legal service discussion.
I just want to make sure that that's not. Sarah?
All right. Good afternoon, Mayor, Council. I have 11 slides. That includes the intro and the bottom, so I only have a few for your consideration. So today is a recommendation to hire an in-house attorney for legal services, and relationship to council goals is this: to support council goals of leadership by ensuring efficiency and effectiveness in city operations. So as you're aware, our current city attorney has given notice, and through his grace, he said he's going to continue until we find a replacement, which has been really nice because we've got so many other openings that we're trying to fill for to have that. That's very nice. However, we need to be respectful of his time, and that's why I'm here in front of you today, is to discuss with you legal services and how we should move forward in legal services to the community, to you, to staff. So just quick background. Legal services, there is a note in the city charter that states the city attorney shall be the chief legal officer of the city. The city manager shall hire and or terminate the city attorney subject to consent of the majority of council currently holding office. So the essential duties of general legal services and the city attorney would be to advise city officials on matters relating to city business, attend city council meetings, prepare and review staff development ordinances and resolutions, review current state and federal legislation, litigation, and advise, provide legal opinions on matters relating to city activities, make recommendations for updating existing city codes, resolutions, and other policies, and advise on and participate in code enforcement activities. So just to give you a general background, the city uses legal services in a variety of ways. It's not just Mark who provides us with legal services. That is the general legal services. We do have a labor attorney that's specific for some of our collective bargaining agreements. We do utilize city-county insurance, pre-law services, tort claims, or workers' comp. If there's a tort claim or workers' comp, we have legal services through CIS that help us with that. And then also another legal service that we use on occasion, which we will be using in the future, is bond counsel, associated with bonds, say for instance, a water treatment plant. In 2009, the city transitioned from an in-house legal service to contracted services with the current law firm, Hornecker and Cowling. Before 2009, there was a legal department and it was in-house. There was one FTE attorney and one full-time employee legal assistant. So we've done both over the years, and we've actually had even larger attorney staff also in the past, but we ended with two FTE in legal. So it is the recommendation that we go through and do an in-house attorney. And let me give you some ideas from a city perspective on comparisons. So we took the 5 up and 5 down of cities' population size that are similar to us. And cities do it both ways. Some of them contract, some of them have in-house attorneys. The following cities here do have in-house attorneys: Tigard, Kaiser, McMinnville, Redmond, Tualatin, Klamath Falls, Ashland, and this is just Grants Pass showing what the cost of a city attorney would be if we were to have a city attorney, ranging in that, with the average being that the salary schedule would be 116 to 146. So of those cities, a number of them also have legal services associated with that. That would be a legal aid or legal assistant or something along those lines. 2 of them don't at this time. That would be Tigard, and that would be also Redmond, although Redmond did mention that they are looking at potentially adding 1 in 2 years. If we were to do a legal assistant, the salary range would be $51,000 to $65,000.
Aaron, I'm going to butt in here for a minute. Like we talked about before, it's important to note Tigard, that's the biggest city on that list, it has a hybrid model for legal services. So they have an ongoing contract with a firm, a pretty substantial contract, and they have an in-house person. So they do both, and that would probably partly explain the no legal
The no
assistant
match.
there. Yeah.
Okay. So salary and benefits, if we were to do an in-house. So city attorney, 1 FTE would be 2080 hours a year. So that would be all in, you're talking benefits also, $183,000 to $227,000 a year. In talking with Mark and trying to look at workflow and workload, et cetera, we believe it would be a little overkill to have 1 attorney and 1 legal aid for the city. So what we'd be looking at is utilizing 1 FTE for a city attorney and hiring a city attorney at that cost, and then having 0.25 FTE workload associated with someone to help with the assistance to the attorney, in-house attorney. So currently, our contract cost with Mark's firm is for the past 2019-2020 has been about $200,000 a year. And however, it's something to note that is really under market value. When Mark came in 2009, the fee was $175 an hour. Due to the grace of Mark and knowing this community, he's kept that rate since 2009 and has never had a rate increase. And looking at the going rate now of an attorney to do this, we'd be looking at $225 an hour. So to outsource for the same amount of hours, which are approximately 1,150 hours a year, we'd be looking at $258,000, which is at the high end of doing 1 FTE in-house with a 0.25 FTE for legal assistance. With an in-house attorney, your per cost hour is fixed because the number of hours is fixed at 2080 per year. The characteristics of a variable cost is that on a unit basis, the cost of fixed being the $225 an hour is there, but the total varies depending on what the projects and the workload is, the hours worked throughout the year. So if you're to technically double that 1150 hours at $225 an hour, you'd be at almost $400,000 a year compared to the city at about $250,000 a year. So in addition to variable hours with a fixed cost system, it would also allow us to be more, we believe that with an in-house attorney, we'd be getting that 20-80 hours a year, which would provide for some additional hours of focus for that legal services to focus on code amendments, attendance at potentially additional meetings when it's beneficial, say the Urban Area Planning Commission. It'd be that this individual would be in addition to strategic planning. They'd also be in addition to the X team, and the in-house legal services may increase the availability of queuing new inquiries as individuals that are housed on the city property are there and immediately able to be responsive. Although I do want to note that Mark has been responsive very well throughout the years, and that has not been an issue. But we may be able to get additional workload because we do have a fixed cost associated with the 20-80 hours instead of the variable cost based on a per hour at whatever we may have, which may be $11.50, it could be $1,500, it could be $900. So after talking with the X team, talking with Mark, we believe that it would be best moving forward to hire an in-house attorney for the city's future needs, current and future needs. And that's why I'm here today to get your concurrence on opening a position for legal services. And with that, and you've got two options. We need to replace Mark. So the two options are, you can concur with the recommendation to go ahead and do an in-house legal, or you can provide direction to do an RFP, and we try to see what's out there from the standpoint of contract services. And with that, Mayor, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Aaron. Questions? Rick?
Thank you, Aaron. I think this idea has a lot of merit, but the one question I do have, the years that Mark has been with us, he has the expertise and resource of his law firm for extra questions and so forth. How much benefit have we enjoyed from that? Or when he had to use somebody else in his office, did we incur an additional expense, and what type of parameters were on that?
Great question. Mark and I talked about that, and he's probably the best one to respond to that question.
Well, so those total costs would be, the majority of those would be me, although those last 2 years on there both involved some pretty significant litigation matters. And when that happens, then I would still have the majority of costs because I'm here all the time. But like Joe Kellerman, who you've all seen here before, he would have a significant amount of time on there as well when you have like an ongoing litigation issue. And, you know, one of the nice elements of the agreement we had, or that we still have for a little while now, is that very reasonable as far as legal services rate applies throughout my firm. So regardless of whether or not someone else is working on something, we're all working at that rate.
So Mark, do you have a ballpark cost, which you think your law firm has provided either directly or indirectly, that we would have to go outside to do now separately, what that we could be facing?
Well, so it's total speculation, but as you all recall, in the Oslin litigation, or the J Street property litigation, the property owners, the owners in that case incurred, I think, around $300,000 in legal fees. And if we had an in-house person while that litigation was going, that person very, very, very likely would have had to have outsourced that litigation. And, you know, generally when you're working for a public entity, you're willing to reduce your hourly rate below your normal rate. But if the city were to have to acquire outside litigation services for that that attorney's normal rate probably would have been $500 an hour, and their discounted rate probably would have been $400 an hour. And so that would have been another $150,000 probably, just a guess.
So I want to add to that question also. So in essence, if we had an in-house attorney through the condemnation process, like Mark mentioned, almost the same thing would have occurred. So the numbers that you're looking at for the cost of about $200,000 a year is for general legal aid for the city. The condemnation aspect of it was an additional cost. I did not include this in this because that was an additional cost that ultimately I think in 2021 or 2020 it was about $330,000 total, including the $200,000 that Mark usually had, or is around $300,000. So there was an increase because of that. So we were able to just utilize the law firm that Mark works for and with, as they had an in-house attorney that was for that. So if we had someone that was in-house here, we would, for condemnation process, likely contract out that service. In essence, sort of like what we did but we did it with the same firm.
Other questions? All right, no more questions. We'll move on to discussion. Council? Brian, then Valerie?
I think this is a good idea overall. The one thought that I had is I was a little bit concerned, at the beginning, when we first bring on the attorney, the costs look pretty close to what we pay now. As the years go on, those costs are going to go up as that attorney has step increases. So I do have a little bit of concern about cost escalation and how we would mitigate that or account for that in future years. And one idea that I had for that was to maybe consider having a city attorney at 3/4 time FTE. What that would do is that would obviously lower the cost for that position. It would still give us, many more hours than we have currently with Mark at approximately half-time. So we would get more hours, it would cost less money. Potentially it would be easier to hire somebody at 3/4 time, given how quality of life is important to so many people these days. And then, whatever money we're saving there, we could potentially set aside to use for outside legal services as needed for things that come up in specialized situations.
So may I respond to that?
Sure.
So that could work. You would save some money by going 3/4 time, but the reality is, as soon as you go over 50% FTE, you're having to pay basically full benefits. So your economy of scale is, if we have next to no one that is 0.75 in the city. I don't think we have anybody. They're either at 49% or they're at 100%, because the economy of scale associated with a 0.75 FTE doesn't pencil out because of the medical and the PERS associated with that individual.
Do you have a number of approximately what that salary difference would be?
Yes, the salary for a city attorney would be 116 to 146. And then the rest is in benefits.
Okay, so it would save 30 to 40,000 a year approximately of salary, roughly.
Yeah, potentially $30,000 a year, but you'd still have to pay the additional
benefits.
Yep.
But I think the point is that an attorney's salary schedule is going to make a lot more impact than somebody making $15 or $20 an hour. Let's see, Valerie and then Joel.
Yeah, I am in favor of moving forward with the recommendation. I can't imagine having a 3/4, just as much time as I think an attorney. I can't imagine Mark working half. I know he works more than half time for us at this point in time, so I can't see having a, not paying for a full-time person. Because I think if they're here and they're here all the time, I can think of a million ways that I would utilize them just in terms of asking questions. And I agree, Mark has been very responsive. When I've had questions, he's always returned them, and I do appreciate that. But I'm in favor of the recommendation of hiring an in-house lawyer.
Joel, then DJ.
So, you know, one of the things when you're hiring somebody is how big a job is it? So is the job a full FTE job workload, or is it 0.75 workload with, so I would you want to answer that, Aaron? What is the workload for the attorney? Is the workload a full-time job?
I think it can be a full-time job if we continue to do. Mark has been very proactive on a number of issues, but I think that there's room for us to even more, and we could take it to that next level, be more timely and be able to bring things to you more than we are now.
So if the workload is a full-time job, then we would need a full-time employee. If the workload is 0.75, then you hire, you know. So I would say the workload determines that, and if we got the workload of a full-time, then I would support that and move forward.
I believe the data that was presented was that Mark billed us at 1,080 or 1150 hours per year, and a full-time person would be 2080. So that is why we're having this discussion, is because there's a discrepancy there. DJ?
Sure, yeah, all things considered, in-house attorney, full-time position, I'm all in.
And I'd like to add, I think there is some, from a standpoint of efficiency perspective, there are benefits of both, but from contracting out with the legal firm, there are some efficiencies that you have that you don't have with a in-house attorney, which helps make some of the hours more effective and efficient. And Mark might be able to highlight this some more. With a team like Mark has right now, if there's something that's not in his wheelhouse of expertise, he gets on the phone and calls a partner and is done. So that's a quick response. With an in-house legal attorney, he doesn't have that resource, so it does take them, I think it would take them a little bit more time to do some of the work that is required. But Mark, maybe you can highlight that.
Yeah, that's correct. I think that I have a lot of time savings involved built in just by virtue of what Aaron said, where, you know, we'll have an employment law issue come up, and either I'll pick up the phone and call one of my partners who specializes in that, and he'll know the answer right away, or I'll just have Diana call him, for example, and he can just tell her directly. Whereas a lot of times, in-house government attorneys, they live a fairly cloistered existence. They're not in a law firm exchanging information with attorneys of various different specialties, and so they may spend several hours trying to get to the answer on something, whereas we oftentimes know it right away. And I have another partner in my office who's been the city attorney of a smaller yet good-sized Southern Oregon city for a long time, and you know, we help each other in that regard. So there's a lot of efficiencies. I have a ton of experience in real estate, leasing, and whatnot. So easements, when we have those types of issues, and those come up a lot, I have already done all those things many times, and I essentially would have a template for nearly everything. That's not the case most oftentimes with in-house legal services.
All right, well, I'm hearing, I guess, overall support for bringing it in-house. Do you guys want to move this to a, do we need to move it to a formal, or you just need a direction?
The position is created, I believe, already in the salary schedule. I just need direction from you on if this is something you concur with, as it states in the charter that hiring and firing of the attorney needs to be in concurrence with the city council. So if I'm going to do it in-house, then that needs to be the case. If I'm going to do it through an RFP process, then it would be going through, we would get the concurrence with council through an RFP process. So,
Vanessa and Rob, do you have anything?
Nothing to add, thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. This is Vanessa. I'm in support of moving forward as recommended with in-house.
All right. In that case, it sounds like we are supportive of moving forward with in-house. All right.
okay, thank you, Mayor, Council.
Thank you. And Next up, let's see, we are going into executive session, and I'll give you all a heads up. I'm going to give us a 10-minute recess after I read the note here. The council will now meet in executive session for the purpose of discussing those subjects previously noticed for this executive session, which are real estate property transactions and consultation with attorney regarding current and likely litigation. This executive session is held pursuant to ORS 192.660 and more specifically under the subsections of that statute which have been publicly noticed for this meeting. Representatives of the news media and designated staff shall be allowed to attend the executive session. All other